Aegon Targaryen stood upon the wind-scoured promontory of Dragonstone, staring out across the narrow sea. The castle's black stone towers rose like talons around him, harbors of half-hidden corridors where the sea winds howled. He was clad in dark leathers, a cloak of crimson pinned at his shoulder by a small golden clasp in the shape of a three-headed dragon. Always that sigil, the sign of his house, House Targaryen, the blood of old Valyria, they whispered. Aegon's hair, pale silver gold, typical of his lineage, whipped behind him in the sharp breeze, and his gaze was fixed not on the horizon so much as on the shape of the future as he envisioned it. The world was about to change. It was the 10th day of the 7th moon. Aegon had set the date, though no formal coronation had yet crowned him king of Westeros. In truth, he was not a king of any land in the 7 kingdoms, not yet. But that would change if he had his way. In another life, another turn of destiny, Aegon would have found Westeros fractious and divided, a land of petty rivalries among the great lords, with each king or lord paramount nursing his old grudges. A land ripe for conquest. But the rumor borne across the seas now was that Westeros had unified under one banner in the face of a greater threat from beyond. There was talk of a great alliance, hammered together from ancient houses that had once warred among themselves. Now they stood together, at least in principle, behind a single High King whose seat was at Harrenhal. Word went that even the North had pledged fealty, that the Arryns had joined, that the Lannisters and the Tyrells had sworn the same oath, that the Baratheons and the Martells had knelt. Indeed, it was said the Greyjoys of the Iron Islands had bound themselves to this new alliance as well. Aegon wanted confirmation. He was no fool. The might of Westeros, truly unified, would be a far greater force than the scattered houses he had once planned to pick off one at a time. The question was whether such unity was more myth than reality. Could the lords truly put aside their rivalries so swiftly? Perhaps they only wore a mask of oneness. Even if they were genuine in their unity, Aegon had 3 dragons at his command, a weapon that had not been seen in this part of the world for centuries. He had an advantage, and yet the stories of Harrenhal's walls, taller than any siege tower, thicker than many a fortress's entire outer ward, lingered in his mind. There was a reason the rumored High King had chosen Harren, the Black's monstrous fortress, as the seat of his new realm. It would be difficult to break, even from the back of a dragon. Aegon turned away from the edge of the battlement, descending the steps into the yard. Down in the courtyard, a swirl of activity greeted him. Soldiers of House Targaryen, men who had pledged their steel to his cause. Gray-faced servants hurrying about with crates of supplies, the black and red banners snapping overhead. And most important, his sisters. Visenya, tall and regal, her hair in tight braids, stood speaking with the captain of the guard. She caught sight of Aegon and lifted her chin in acknowledgement. Rhaenys, the younger sister, was perched on the edge of a stone bench, mapping out flight paths in chalk on a wooden board. Her cloak was a swirl of red satin, and her eyes gleamed with excitement. She was always the dreamer, the sister who saw the shape of battles yet to be fought and seemed delighted by the possibility. Aegon approached Rhaenys first. "Any word from the scouts?" he asked. He needed news, not guesses, though Rhaenys' guesses often proved uncannily accurate. "Just rumors," Rhaenys replied. "One says the Northmen have marched south, that the Starks have already taken up station near Moat Cailin to block any approach by land. Another says Lord Lannister is at Harrenhal, and that King, or High King Roland, is mustering a host of near 50,000 men. But which is truth and which is rumor? We'll need better eyes." Aegon grunted. "Ravens can be intercepted. Unreliable. We'll confirm with our own eyes soon enough." She tapped the chalk against her palm. "I can ride Merax's west, skirt the mainland, see what I can see. But Visenya might do better to go north on Vhagar. Merax's is faster, but Vhagar's flame is more fearsome." She paused, lips curving in a thoughtful smile. "Or we do the opposite. I go north, she goes west. The main question, will our enemies see it as threat or parley if they spy dragons overhead?" He watched her, silently gauging. "They should fear it. We are not here to parley, except on our terms. though a little fear might well serve to unify them further against us. But that's inevitable. Rhaenys chuckled. Yes, that is the game. We must ensure their fear does not galvanize them too strongly. Aegon's expression grew distant. A formidable opponent, a unified Westeros. I doubt they can hold that unity for long, but for the moment we must be cautious. Harrenhal is a fortress like no other. We have Balerion, Meraxes, and Vhagar. Yet one slip, one single misstep, and they could do to us what no one in the known world has done since the Doom: destroy the blood of old Valyria. Rhaenys' lips parted. It was not often Aegon spoke with such gravitas. We must proceed wisely. Aegon left her to her plans and crossed the courtyard to Visenya. She wore a suit of ringmail, gleaming under the sun's light, the black surcoat emblazoned with the three-headed dragon. Even at rest she had a martial bearing. Aegon admired her unwavering confidence, how her hand never drifted far from the pommel of Dark Sister, the Valyrian steel blade she favored. Visenya had taken upon herself to drill their men each morning, forging discipline from raw recruits. She lifted a gauntlet hand in salute. Brother, preparations are nearly complete. The men are fit, the ships readied. We only await your word to sail. Aegon nodded. I want you to take Vhagar tomorrow. Fly north and see if you can spot the Stark host. They say the king in the north has pledged to march to Harrenhal. Confirm if that is true. If it is, we might intercept them before they join forces with the High King. The fewer men behind Harrenhal's walls, the better. Visenya frowned. An attack on the road might be wise or foolish, depending on where they gather. The swamps of the Neck can be treacherous. Even from Dragonback, we must not underestimate the North's cunning. They have cunning men, wargs, and the old magic behind them, or so the stories say. Aegon's jaw tightened. We should not discount legends, but still our advantage is in the sky. If we isolate the Northmen from the main alliance, we reduce their combined strength. I will not let them gather unopposed. She crossed her arms. I'll go on the morrow, then. I will watch from above and see what transpires. Aegon placed his hand briefly on her shoulder. Be safe. If they mean to unify, they'll watch for dragons. Visenya's only answer was a firm nod. She turned back to instruct the captain of the guard. Aegon surveyed his men once more. For 1,000 foot, perhaps, and 1,000 knights sworn to House Targaryen. Another 1,000 or so camp followers and auxiliaries from the lands loyal to him across Blackwater Bay. Not nearly enough to face the entire might of Westeros united. He would have to be cunning. He passed along the stables, where the stablemaster was grooming a pair of fine destriers with black coats. The beasts whickered as Aegon passed, and he laid a calming palm on one's flank. That same palm had guided Balerion in flight, had loosed dragonfire upon those who defied him in past scuffles across the narrow sea. He found it almost strange to think that these well-bred warhorses could prove as vital to his cause as the great dragons themselves. Should it come to pitched battles on the ground, a cavalry charge might decide the day as much as fire from the skies. He made his way up through the castle and into the hall where a large carved table had been erected. The painted table. In this chamber, a grand map of Westeros stretched before him in cunning detail, every river and mountain ridge represented. Aegon placed both hands on the table's edge, eyes roving from the north down to Dorne, scanning the territory he meant to conquer. So many houses, so many banners, so many potential obstacles. And now it seemed they were fused by a single cause resisting Targaryen rule. A single monarchy, if that rumor was true. He traced a path with his finger from the Vale westward to the Riverlands, then south to the Reach. Such unity had always been a dream for some. If the new High King truly sat enthroned at Harrenhal, then the first step for Aegon was clear. Break the new monarchy, or bend it to his will. But how? The voice at the back of his mind whispered. Fire and blood. His house words. They had never failed him. And yet an entire continent braced against him. The painted table drew him into the swirl of possibilities. Here was Storm's End, seat of House Baratheon, traditionally fractious, proud. Then Casterly Rock, seat of the Lannisters. They might rally a great host. Highgarden, the Tyrells with their endless fields of grain and storehouses of plenty. Winterfell, the old seat of the Starks, stoic and distant. The Arryns perched behind the impenetrable heights of the Eyrie. The Greyjoys in the Iron Islands, formidable at sea. The Tullys of Riverrun controlling the Riverlands. The Martells in Sunspear, cunning and elusive. If they all truly formed one realm under a single High King, Aegon would need more than raw strength. He might need alliances of his own. But who would ally with the Targaryens in this new, defiant Westeros? All this weighed on him as hours drifted by. Servants brought meals, light fare of bread, fish, some spiced wine. But Aegon barely touched them. He was lost in thought, lost in calculations. At last, near the midnight hour, he took himself to his private chambers for a few hours of restless sleep. The dawn would bring decisions. He awakened to the sound of gulls crying. The cawing echoed across the battlements. Aegon dressed swiftly in a plain tunic and breeches, belting on a short sword for practicality's sake. Outside, dawn's glow was spreading across the sky, painting the waters a pale gold. Down in the courtyard, the dragons stirred. Balerion, Meraxes, and Vhagar each had their lairs and feeding grounds, but they seemed restless, as though they sensed the tension in their masters. Aegon walked across the drawbridge that led to the outer wards, where Balerion was being fed the carcass of a slaughtered bull. The Black Dread lowered his massive head, jaws opening wide to reveal fangs like swords. Aegon stepped closer, unafraid. He reached a hand forward, careful to keep well clear of the great beast's snapping mouth, and ran his palm over the scales along the side of Balerion's neck. Thick scales, black as night, glimmering faintly in the morning light. "Soon," Aegon murmured. "Soon we fly." Balerion's golden eyes regarded him, unblinking. The bull's carcass was swiftly torn apart, the stench of blood and offal rising in the salt air. Servants hastened to drag away the remains. The dragon's tail swept across the courtyard, prompting them to scramble for safety. Aegon turned away at last. He found Rhaenys already saddling Meraxes, determined to begin her own scouting. A final clasp of arms between them. Then she mounted, her dark hair braided back from her face. Meraxes' wings unfurled, shining silver in the early sun. "Gods be with you," Aegon said. Rhaenys smiled a little smile. "And with you, brother." Then she urged the dragon up, and Meraxes rose from the courtyard in a thunderous wash of wind, the creature's roar echoing off the walls of Dragonstone. Aegon watched until she was only a speck in the sky, heading west. Visenya would leave later in the day, heading north to the Neck, to see if the Starks truly marched. Then would come the next move. The waiting was the hardest part. 2 days passed in uneasy calm. News reached Dragonstone in fragments. A fisherman's sloop came with word that a great host had indeed been sighted crossing the Trident. Another merchant ship reported sightings of a smaller force near the Blackwater Rush. Then, just as the sun set on the second day, the sky thundered with the beating of dragon wings. Meraxes descended, her belly streaked with mud, her sides flecked with arrows. Arrows that had not penetrated deeply, but enough to rouse Aegon's alarm. Rhaenys slid from the saddle, her face pale but determined, her leather flight gear scored with a few cuts. Aegon rushed forward. "You were attacked?" Rhaenys nodded briskly, exhaling. "Outside the walls of Harrenhal. They've built scorpions. There are archers stationed on the battlements, watchers in the fields. They saw me coming from afar, and though we were too high for them to do any real harm, it was an unwelcome surprise. They've prepared for dragons, Aegon. They are not the ignorant lords we might have faced had they been divided." She paused to let a servant help remove her riding gear. "I saw companies drilling in the outer wards. More men than I expected. And I glimpsed banners. Stag, lion, rose, falcon, trout, kraken, sun and spear, wolf. They're all there. The High King is a man named Roland Tully, though that's new to me. I didn't even know the Tullys had produced a man so ambitious." Aegon's brows rose. "A Tully, enthroned as High King?" She gave a short laugh. Times are strange indeed. The Tullus once were lesser lords in the Riverlands, overshadowed by the Harrenhal kings. Harren the Black overshadowed them all. But from what I gathered, it was Tully who led the push to unify. They named him High King because he had the cunning to rally the houses that hated Harren and the Ironborn. And ironically, when Harren was slain by an internal coup some moons ago, Tully took over Harrenhal. That, plus alliances with the mightiest lords in Westeros, gave him a strong foundation. The lords fear the old wars, so they welcomed his leadership, for now. And they all stand behind him? Aegon asked. Rhaenys shook her head. They have joined, but whether they stand wholeheartedly is another question. Still, the sight of those many banners fluttering side by side, Aegon, they mean to fight as one. Harrenhal's walls are manned by men from all the realms. The Scorpions, the Archers, they intend to kill dragons. And they might succeed if we are careless. Aegon's face grew somber. Let them try. We shall not be careless. Not many hours later, Visenya returned from the north. Her hair was windswept, her expression grim. Starks are on the move, she announced. They have a host of 10,000, maybe more, marching down the King's Road. They are not alone. I spotted banners of House Bolton, Serwyn, Manderley. They are on their way south, presumably to Harrenhal. I also saw outriders with sigils I did not recognize, a black banner with a white sun. Minor houses from the far north, presumably. They marched in good order, and I counted many supply wagons. They are in for a long campaign. Aegon paced the courtyard, the setting sun casting long shadows. 10,000 from the north, plus the tens of thousands we suspect are gathered in the Riverlands. The Vale can muster, the Westerlands, the Reach, the Stormlands, Dorne. All told, the rumors of a combined force of 50,000 men might not be far off the mark. Or more. This changes everything. His sisters exchanged glances. Then Rhaenys spoke softly. We have the dragons. That is no small advantage, even against tens of thousands of men. But if they mass their scorpions, if they find a way to harry us from the skies, it will not be simple. We must not fight them all in one place. We have to divide them somehow or turn some houses to our side. A wedge must be driven into their unity. Visenya laid a hand on the hilt of Dark Sister. The question is, who? The Lannisters are famously proud and wealthy. The Starks honorable but aloof. The Tyrells pragmatic with no love lost for the old hierarchy. The Baratheons stubborn. Martell vengeful, and they always keep to themselves. The Arryns honor-bound but vulnerable behind the mountains of the moon. The Tullus, ironically, are in ascendance. They have the seat of power at Harrenhal now, apparently. Aegon considered. We might approach the Reach. The Tyrells were stewards of Highgarden before taking it over from House Gardner, if I recall. Perhaps a promise of alliance, or a marriage pact, might break them away. But it's a gamble, and we have little time to dally with proposals. Meanwhile, the Storm King Argilax's line. He paused. No, Argilax was slain some years back. House Baratheon might be open to an alliance, but if they've bent the knee to Tully, we must find a crack in their unity. He looked to Rhaenys. Take a few days' rest. Then I want you to fly to Storm's End under a banner of parley. We offer them a chance to rise higher in the new order under Targaryen rule than they might under Tully. If they refuse, so be it. Rhaenys lifted a brow. They might just shoot me down. Still, the Stormlanders respect boldness. I will go. Visenya gave a small huff. We cannot rely on talk alone. Let me fly to Winterfell and speak with the Starks. They are honorable folk, or so the tales say. Perhaps there is a way to keep them from marching south. Aegon exhaled. If you think it wise, do so. But the moment we suspect treachery, we withdraw. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of it all. The Targaryens had dreamed of conquest, but that dream had always centered on a divided land. Now, that dream had collided with a newly unified Westeros, forging a challenge unlike any in centuries. Well, it would be a test of House Targaryen's right to rule. If they triumphed here, none could deny the power of the dragons. Over the next few days, the small fleet of Dragonstone prepared for possible departures. Aegon sent out discreet envoys to the ports of Crackclaw Point, trying to gauge the local sentiment. Could some of the lesser lords, the bog devils and the clans, be induced to switch loyalties and fight for Targaryen gold? Meanwhile, he waited for Rhaenys to return from Storm's End. She came back a fortnight later, her mood grim. "They refused," she said, dismounting mare axes with a slump of her shoulders. "The Castellan let me land, and we spoke as politely as possible. But in the end, House Baratheon is sworn to Tully's cause. Their official stance is that they will hold to the unity of Westeros in the face of foreign invasion." Aegon's mouth flattened into a line. "Then so be it. We offered them a chance. And we might have had a chance, if not for the presence of so many knights from other realms in the courtyard," Rhaenys said. "I saw a Tyrell envoy there, a Lannister herald. Their alliances run deep already. The Stormlands will not betray the new High King easily." "And the North?" Aegon asked Visenya, who had been waiting with grim impatience. "I did not go. Word reached me that Lord Stark was already well beyond Moat Cailin, marching south at pace. No point in flying to an empty castle. Besides, I found no sign that the Starks are ready to break from Tully." She frowned. "This new High King Roland must be a cunning man indeed, or he has the Seven on his side. We must prepare for war in earnest." And so they did. The Targaryen knights assembled on Dragonstone. Levies were called up from Massey's Hook, from the lands across Blackwater Bay still loyal to the Targaryens or merely unsettled by the Great Alliance. But the numbers were not promising. Perhaps 6,000 foot, 1,500 horse at most. Paltry for CE compared to the rumored 50,000 or more that Westeros could bring to bear. Even if the Targaryens tried to land near King's Landing and carve out a foothold, they would be swarmed by the allied armies. Unless Aegon turned his thoughts to the dragons. They were the key. In the old days of Valyria, an army led by dragons could scatter far larger forces. The devastation wrought by dragonfire could break an enemy's spirit. But if the foe had truly prepared, built scorpions, trained crossbowmen, tested new means of repelling aerial assault, this might turn into a protracted conflict. A war of attrition might favor Westeros. Another approach was needed. Aegon had them load the ships not for a direct assault on Harrenhal, but for a more cunning gambit. "We will land north of Crackclaw Point, near the Bay of Crabs," he told his gathered captains. "Let them think we aim for the Riverlands. Then we strike out swiftly and decisively at the lands behind them, Stony Shore or even the Vale's coastline. We force them to spread out their defenses." The captains exchanged uncertain glances, but none dared contradict him outright. Aegon's calm authority, honed by years on Dragonstone, was absolute. The sisters, too, nodded in careful agreement. Yet, as the days stretched out in planning, new reports arrived. The Alliance had posted watchers at every coastal approach. Warships with the Kraken sigil of the Iron Islands were said to be patrolling. In the sky, the Targaryens held an advantage. By sea, the foe had numbers. By land, the foe had greater forces. It was a noose tightening around them. One night, Aegon stood alone in the courtyard, gazing at the black sky. The stars twinkled above, but the moon was hidden behind cloud. The sea wind ruffled his cloak. He remembered the stories of old Valyria, the freehold that spanned continents, the dragon lords who strode the world like gods. He had always felt the weight of that legacy. He whispered under his breath, "Is it destiny that we conquer, or are we mortal after all?" His musings were interrupted by a low voice. Visenya had approached, silent as a cat. "We are mortal," she said, "but we have dragons. Let us not forget that both truths matter." Aegon nodded. "I was just thinking, we must strike a blow that proves our might, something that rattles the Alliance. If they see that unity only brings them suffering, if they see that resisting us is futile, perhaps they will turn on each other." He paused. "Harrenhal is the symbol of their new monarchy. That fortress is unassailable by normal means, so we shall assail it with dragonfire." Visenya's eyes lit with a fierce gleam. "Burn the seat of the High King, just as Balerion once turned fields to ash in the wars across Essos." But Harrenhal is built to withstand even a dragon's assault, or so the legends say. The walls are thick, the towers monstrous. Aegon's lips curled. All walls can melt under enough flame. She tilted her head. And what of the scorpions they've mounted on those walls? If we attempt a direct assault, we risk losing one or more of the dragons. That would be the end of everything. Aegon clenched his fists. We will do it cleverly. A night assault, perhaps, or we feint from different directions. Rhaenys from the east, you from the west, me from above. They cannot shoot at all three dragons effectively. We focus on a single tower first, breach it with dragonfire, and watch panic spread. It will be dangerous, Visenya said, but it might work. If we burn Harrenhal, we decapitate the alliance. Rhaenys joined them soon after, hearing the plan. Her face lit with excitement, though a hint of worry lingered in her eyes. If Tully flees or dies, that might sow chaos, she agreed. But let us not forget that the other lords might rally still. The symbol matters, yes, but so does the reality. If we slay their king, do we instantly become masters of Westeros? Or do they appoint another? Possibly a Lannister or a Tyrell. Aegon sighed. We cannot know, but it's a blow we must strike. Our best chance to shatter their unity is to deliver a show of force that no one can ignore. We will proceed with the plan to land near the Bay of Crabs, then circle around quickly to Harrenhal. With the dragons, we can cover ground rapidly. Our ground troops will remain at a safe distance until we see if the fortress falls. Once Harrenhal is broken, the lords will flee or kneel. So it was decided. The Targaryen fleet set sail at night, slipping away from Dragonstone under a cloak of darkness. Several days of wary sailing followed, the ships hugging the coast, keeping watch for ironborn longships or other alliance vessels. They saw a few sails in the distance, but no open engagements occurred. The Targaryens made landfall at the Bay of Crabs, near the inlet known as Crackclaw Point. As soon as they landed, Aegon wasted no time unloading the horses, the provisions, and the men. A small wood rose near the shoreline, giving them some cover. From there, they could regroup, rearm, and wait for nightfall. Word would surely spread that Targaryen ships had landed, but with any luck, they had a day or two before the alliance could respond in full force. That night, under the waxing moon, the three dragons took flight. Aegon rode Balerion, the Black Dread, the largest and fiercest of the three, whose wings blocked out half the stars in the sky. Visenya rode Vhagar, deep green in hue, her roars echoing. Rhaenys, on mare axes, silver-scaled and swift, took the lead, for she had seen the fortress from above before. They soared inland, high enough to avoid watchers on the roads. Below, they saw scattered farmsteads, occasional flickers of torchlight, a patrol of riders somewhere, trying to keep watch on the Targaryen approach. But dragons needed no roads. Hours passed, the wind biting at their faces. Then, rising in the distance under the moon's pale glow, they saw Harrenhal. Even from far away, its monstrous silhouette stood out. 5 colossal towers, walls so massive they seemed to defy all logic. The fortress that Harren the Black had built was the largest in the 7 kingdoms. A fortress so vast it was said 1,000 men could dine in its great hall. At night, torchlight glimmered on the battlements, revealing a defensive perimeter readied for war. Even from above, they could see the faint outlines of scorpions stationed at intervals along the walls, big enough to fling a bolt the size of a spear. Archers, too, would be on high alert for any sign of wings in the night sky. The Targaryens circled once, carefully. Aegon was the pivot, with Balerion's dark wings blending into the sky. Meraxes flew off to the east, and Vhagar to the west, each waiting for the signal. Aegon's heart hammered in his chest. In that moment, suspended between the stars above and the fortress below, he felt the full measure of the risk they were taking. If the dragons fell, House Targaryen would be undone. If they succeeded, perhaps they would carve their names into Westerosi history, forging a new dynasty. There was no middle ground now. He raised an arm, and from across the dark sky, 2 flickers of dragon flame emerged, signals from his sisters that they were in position. Aegon patted the side of Balerian's neck, and the great beast rumbled deep in its chest. Then he angled down into a dive. The wind screamed past his ears as they plummeted. Nearer, nearer. He felt Balerian's heat rising from below the scales, building in the dragon's throat. The fortress rushed up to meet them. Suddenly, a horn blast echoed from the walls. They had been spotted. A flare of fire soared upward, some kind of signal rocket. Aegon tensed. Then he saw the glint of ballista bolts launching from the scorpions, arcing up into the sky. He veered Balerion aside, feeling one bolt whip past. Another soared wide. The dragons were notoriously difficult to hit in flight if they kept moving. But the Alliance garrison was clearly well-drilled. Balerion roared, a deafening sound that rattled the very stones. Aegon spied movement in one of the massive towers, archers flitting about, scorpions being cranked. Time to strike. He guided Balerion to release a jet of flame. It lanced down into the tower's crown, igniting the wooden hoardings and sending men scrambling. Screams echoed into the night. At the same time, from the eastern flank came a roar of fire. Mare axes diving in, scorching the outer walls. From the west, Vhagar's flames streaked across the battlements, setting catwalks alight. Chaos erupted. Men yelled, horns sounded. Aegon pulled up from the first pass, soared high again, then dove once more. This time, a scorpion bolt shot dangerously close, nicking the membrane of Balerion's wing. The dragon shrieked, an angry sound. Aegon felt Balerion's pain and patted the beast's neck, urging calm. The wound seemed minor, but it was a reminder that these defenses were lethal. Below, the fires raged, but Harrenhal's walls stood firm. The thickness of that black stone seemed to repel flame. Where the dragons had set wooden structures ablaze, the fire was fierce, but the stone walls themselves only glowed faintly with heat. Aegon directed Balerion to concentrate on the highest tower, the Tower of Dread, if he remembered its name correctly. If they could melt a portion of that tower, force a collapse, it might undermine the defenders' morale. He circled again, the thunder of wings drowning out the horns below. Rhaenys streaked by on mare axes, strafing another tower with fire. Aegon saw bits of flaming debris shower down onto the courtyard. Men ran in all directions, some ablaze themselves. The stench of burnt flesh wafted upward. Still, the fortress did not yield. Aegon felt a chill. Could it be that Harrenhal was truly strong enough to withstand the fury of dragons? He would not accept that possibility yet. He pressed Balerion into a deeper dive, letting the monstrous dragon's belly almost skim the top of the tower. Then Balerion unleashed a roar of flame that engulfed the stone parapets. Aegon felt the heat radiating upwards. Stone began to crack under the intensity. The catwalk crumbled. A scorpion perched there toppled over the edge, its crew shrieking as they plummeted. Another wave of flame blasted down, and part of the tower's top melted into slag, blackening and dripping. Aegon heard the roar of triumph in Balerion's throat. The dragon exulted in destruction. But from another corner of the fortress, a ballista fired, and a bolt struck. Aegon felt Balerion jerk violently beneath him. The bolt glanced off a thick scale, but the force made the dragon flinch. Pain rippled through their bond. Aegon cursed. They were dangerously close to the fortress. He urged Balerion upward, away from the reach of those scorpions. From on high, he glimpsed Vhagar unleashing flame on another tower, and then a ballista bolt slammed into Vhagar's flank. Visenya's voice rose in an echoing cry, barely audible over the din. The bolt lodged in a gap between scales. The green dragon howled, losing altitude for a moment. Then she flapped away, retreating from the immediate assault. Aegon's heart constricted. If the dragons were forced to withdraw with serious wounds, the entire gambit might fail. He circled around to see if Vhagar was still flight-worthy. Yes, she still flew, though her flight was labored. Visenya guided her out of the range of the scorpions, and from their Vhagar spat fire at more distant structures. Meanwhile, Rhaenys had dived too low, it seemed, for Mare Axes was peppered with arrows from the courtyard. Aegon glimpsed a cluster of men with large crossbows. Most arrows bounced off the dragon's scales, but some found the thinner membranes under the wing. Rhaenys had to veer away, cursing. She unleashed a final burst of flame that consumed several archers. Below, sections of the fortress courtyard were aflame, and the shrieks of dying men rose into the night. But the thick outer walls and the monstrous towers remained largely intact. A few smaller structural collapses had occurred, but nothing decisive. The seat of the High King was battered, yet it still stood. Aegon hovered overhead, uncertain. He could press the attack further, but he might lose a dragon in the process. Even if Harrenhal's defenders lost hundreds, the fortress might remain unconquerable tonight. And then he saw the flicker of a shadow in the courtyard. Something large was being wheeled out, or multiple somethings. More scorpions, bigger ones, each the size of a war wagon. They had evidently been kept in reserve. He saw them angle upward, searching the sky for dragons. One wrong pass and even Balerion could be skewered. He had to make a decision. Risk it all or withdraw. The primal urge to conquer, to force Harrenhal's submission right here and now, warred with the cold logic that told him a Targaryen victory hinged on the dragon's survival. He could not lose Balerion for a single fortress, even if it was Harrenhal. He roared out across the sky, "Visenya! Rhaenys!" hoping they would see him peel off. A final pass might be worth it or might be suicidal. The sisters, seeing the new scorpions, seemed to come to the same conclusion. With heavy hearts, they guided their dragons back, ascending into the cloud cover. Fire raged below, but Harrenhal stood, a fortress wounded but not destroyed. As Aegon climbed higher, he looked back to see flames licking at the tallest tower. Perhaps that tower would collapse in time. Perhaps, but he had not broken their defenses. The Targaryens regrouped in the sky, battered and bleeding. Vagar's flank dripped dark dragon blood. Merryx's wing looked ragged. Even Balerion's black hide was scored. They could not stay. Aegon turned away, leading them back into the night. The flight back to the encampment near the coast was long and somber. Each rider grappled with the sting of partial defeat. They had inflicted suffering, yes, but Harrenhal had repelled them. The seat of the High King might still stand strong. As they landed, the men in the camp let out cheers, for they saw the dragons returning. But those cheers died quickly at the sight of blood dripping from Vagar's flank. A hush fell. Aegon dismounted from Balerion with grim resolve. Soldiers and dragon keepers rushed forward to tend the wounds of the mighty beasts. Visenya slid off Vagar, her face taut with anger. Rhaenys alighted from mare axes, drenched in sweat, her eyes distant. In the command tent, the siblings gathered, ignoring their own exhaustion. Rhaenys slumped in a chair, tugging off her gloves. Gods, I never thought I'd see the day that Harrenhal's walls stood against Dragonfire. Visenya's voice was tight. Part of the top tower may yet collapse, if the fire keeps up, but it's clear that place was built for monstrous durability. Even so, we might have pressed the attack if not for those scorpions. They're more deadly than I feared. Aegon stood, arms folded, gazing at the ground as if he could bore a hole through it with his eyes alone. We came for a decisive blow. Instead, we bled for it and gained nothing except a demonstration of their readiness. Tomorrow, the Alliance will trumpet this as a victory, how the dragons struck at Harrenhal and were forced to retreat. Rhaenys swallowed. What do we do now? Aegon looked up, jaw set. We adapt. Harrenhal may be nearly impregnable, but the rest of the realm is not. They cannot be everywhere at once. We will strike at the lands that feed Harrenhal, burn their fields, sow terror. If the High King must scramble to protect every corner of his new realm, cracks will appear in his grand alliance. When starvation and ruin threaten, will each lord remain loyal to Tully? Perhaps not. We will use the advantage of flight to move quickly, strike at supply lines, at granaries in the Reach, at gold mines in the Westerlands, at ports along the coast. If they spread out to defend, we find an undefended spot and burn it. We fight a war of fire and movement, not a siege. Visenya and Rhaenys listened, nodding slowly. It was not a glorious plan. It was not the majestic conquest they had once pictured, with all the lords kneeling immediately. But perhaps it was the path forward, a war to wear down an entire continent until they bent the knee. Fire and blood indeed. And so the Targaryen War in Westeros entered its next phase. With the memory of the Harrenhal assault fresh in their minds, Aegon and his sisters unleashed the dragons upon less fortified targets. First they struck at a major granary in the Reach, near the Mander's fertile banks, where the Tyrell bannermen had stored wheat and barley for the Alliance's armies. Rhaenys and Meraxes arrived at dawn, swooping down before watchers could raise the alarm. The granary erupted in flames, leaving thousands of bushels of grain reduced to ash. Farmers screamed, and soldiers milled helplessly. A second attack in the same region a day later saw the destruction of a supply train escorted by House Redwyne men-at-arms. Meraxes soared over them, spewing flame, incinerating wagons in moments. At the same time, Visenya and Vhagar targeted a Lannister gold caravan heading east. Though guarded by knights from the Westerlands, they could do little against dragonfire. The knights broke and fled, the gold scattered among scorched earth. Visenya left it there untouchable, as a sign that the Targaryens did not come for mere plunder but for submission. Word spread quickly among the lords. The dragons were harrying their lands, striking like lightning, then disappearing. Garrisons tried to fortify major roads. Archers stood ready on the watch for winged shapes. Some scorpions were mounted on wagons, roving the countryside, hoping to ambush the dragons. But the realm was vast, and the Targaryens moved unpredictably. While his sisters orchestrated these raids, Aegon coordinated from the ground, maneuvering the Targaryen troops to avoid direct confrontation with large alliance armies. Whenever the alliance tried to corner them, the Targaryens would fade away, re-embark on their ships, or relocate to a new staging ground. Frustration began to mount in the alliance ranks, for they had gathered tens of thousands of men, but the Targaryens refused a pitched battle. Instead, entire counties were set aflame, trade routes disrupted. Discontent grew among the local lords, for each was forced to defend his own lands, stretching the alliance's forces thin. Still, the High King did not waver. From Harrenhal, Roland Tully issued edicts, calling on every lord to hold fast, promising that soon the Targaryens would tire, or their dragons would be brought down by cunning. More scorpions were built, more watchers posted. Yet Aegon knew it would take time to see if the realm's unity would fracture. Some houses had begun to grumble. The cost was too high. The small folk suffered. Fields burned. Trade stalled. More than once, rumors reached Aegon that House Greyjoy might slip away from the alliance if their own interests were not met. The men of the Iron Islands cared for plunder, not for the land-based concerns of the Tully monarchy. If Aegon could exploit such cracks, perhaps the alliance would unravel. Weeks turned to months. The Targaryens burned, flew, raided, retreated. The alliance marched, guarded, rebuilt. Meanwhile, Harrenhal remained a looming symbol. Some said a portion of its top tower had collapsed after the Targaryen assault, burying men in molten rubble, but the fortress still held firm. Roland Tully still ruled from within. He had begun to dispatch lords across the realm, determined to put an end to the Targaryen menace. Lord Stark pressed down from the north, leading a large column. The Knights of the Vale, led by Lord Arryn, scoured the riverlands. The Lannisters roamed the west, Arryn Hills in search of Targaryen raiding parties. The Tyrells and Baratheons locked down the south. Every approach seemed guarded. On a cool autumn morning, Aegon stood in the newly established Targaryen camp near a wooded hill northeast of Maidenpool. The drizzle of rain pattered on the tent roofs. Rhaenys and Visenya were with him, conferring on their next move. A soft tread at the entrance made them look up. One of their captains entered, escorting a messenger clad in dark, tattered clothes. The messenger bowed shakily. "My lords, I come from the Iron Islands. My master bids me deliver an offer." In secret, Aegon's eyes narrowed. "Which master?" The messenger swallowed. "Lord Corran Greyjoy, younger brother to the head of House Greyjoy. He says that the Iron Islands chafe under Tully's alliance. They have done the High King's bidding, patrolling the seas, but they have gained little and lost men. Lord Corran wonders if House Targaryen would recognize the Iron Islands' independence or grant them certain favors if they were to break from Tully's cause. Rhaenys shot a sidelong glance at Aegon. Visenya's expression remained stern. Aegon spoke slowly. In other words, House Greyjoy wants to be assured that they will remain lords of the Iron Islands, free of interference, if they abandon the High King. Is that correct? The messenger nodded hastily. Yes, my lord. Lord Corran believes he can sway enough captains in the Iron Fleet to stand down. That might open a path for your ships to land deeper in the west, or at least to hamper Tully's movements. Aegon considered. This could be the wedge he sought. And what does Lord Corran want in return? Assurances of their autonomy, an oath that the Targaryens will not hinder the Ironborn's old ways, raiding, reaving, as long as it does not target Targaryen domains. They want also a share of any spoils from the conquest of the mainland, and perhaps titles on the coast for Corran's men. Visenya snorted. They want a blank check to pillage at will. Rhaenys pressed her lips together. If we indulge them, we risk letting them run amok. That will not endear us to the lords we hope to subjugate. Aegon raised a hand. But if we deny them, we lose a chance to fracture the alliance. If the Ironborn withdraw their ships, the alliance's coastal watch becomes weaker. We could then land a larger force near Lannisport or Fair Isle, striking at the Lannisters directly. And perhaps we can show the realm that the High King's grip is slipping. He turned to the messenger. Tell Lord Corran that House Targaryen is willing to grant the Iron Islands a measure of autonomy under our overlordship, provided they do not raid or reave Targaryen lands or our vassals. We will not hamper them from reaving Essos or elsewhere, as has long been their custom. They can keep their spoils. But let them not lay waste to the western coasts of Westeros without my leave, or that might undermine our attempts to rule. If they betray us, Dragonfire will answer. Understood. The messenger nodded rapidly. Yes, my lord, I shall deliver your terms. And so it began. Word soon reached them that House Greyjoy had ceased its naval patrols. Some Ironborn longships even vanished from alliance formations. Quietly, the cracks were widening. The High King could not keep all the lords in line if they were not reaping benefits. Aegon saw his chance. He commanded a swift operation. While the alliance was busy trying to chase Targaryen raiders in the Crownlands and the Riverlands, Aegon loaded 3,000 men onto ships and sailed them around the continent, hugging the Iron Islands in secret. The Ironborn, now under Corran's covert instructions, did not challenge them. Aegon landed near Case, on the western coast. The local Lannister forces, taken by surprise, scrambled to respond. Swiftly, Aegon seized a small castle that overlooked the sea, proclaiming it a foothold for House Targaryen. Then he sent word for Visenya and Rhaenys to join him by air, while the rest of the Targaryen force marched overland. The Lannisters, outraged, gathered an army to throw Aegon back into the sea. They had expected to keep watch for Targaryen ships approaching from the east, not the west. Meanwhile, the Greyjoy ships remained curiously inactive, neither attacking Aegon nor assisting him overtly. That alone forced the Lannisters to keep a wary eye on the possibility of an Ironborn attack from the sea, dividing their attention. Aegon capitalized on that uncertainty. The Lannister host was led by Lord Lorien Lannister, a proud man with golden curls, who had boasted often that the might of Casterly Rock was unmatched. He marched with some 8,000 men, determined to crush the Targaryen foothold swiftly. But Aegon had chosen his ground carefully. A series of rolling hills near the coastal castle he had seized, providing vantage points for watchers. When the Lannisters advanced, they found Rhaenys and Meraxes overhead, unleashing flame on their baggage train. At the same time, Aegon deployed cavalry to harass their flanks. The Lannisters tried to form ranks for a pitched battle, but Meraxes dove again, scattering the outriders in fire and terror. Some of the men stood firm, loosing arrows, but the scale of damage was undeniable. By the time the day ended, the Lannisters were forced to retreat out of range of the dragon, leaving Aegon's foothold intact. It was a sharp blow to their prestige. They had not been annihilated, but they had been repulsed. Westeros began to see that the Targaryens could land armies anywhere they chose, as long as the Ironborn looked the other way. Doubt crept in among the alliance. The Tyrells worried that a similar amphibious assault might strike the Reach's western coast. The Baratheons, pinned to the Stormlands, fretted they might be isolated. In the north, Stark had come south but had found no decisive engagement. The dragons always slipped away. Houses Tully, Arryn, and Baratheon demanded a grand muster near Harrenhal to launch a major offensive. But the lords were reluctant to abandon their lands, lest the dragons strike in their absence. The High King was forced to make concessions, granting certain privileges or trade advantages to keep them all in line. The cracks were not yet a full fracture, but they were widening. In the midst of all this, autumn rains worsened, turning roads to mud. Supply lines faltered. Disease began to spread in some alliance camps. The Targaryens, more mobile, managed to avoid the worst conditions. But time was still a concern. Dragons or no, the alliance possessed far greater manpower, and if they ever managed to corner the Targaryens in a true field battle, it could be disastrous. Aegon steeled himself for the next step. Attempt a bold strike on Casterly Rock. If he could force the great stronghold of the Lannisters to bend the knee, the alliance might unravel. But it would be dangerous, for the rock was nearly as formidable in its own way as Harrenhal. He gathered Rhaenys and Visenya in a council tent near Case. The smell of salt air mingled with the odor of damp straw. Rhaenys was frowning at a rough map. Casterly Rock is carved from the mountainside. There are limited approaches for dragons to burn. The Lannisters will be well prepared. Is it worth the risk? Visenya rested a hand on her sword pommel. If we break the lions, the rest may lose heart. Aegon nodded, though his expression was pensive. But we've seen how well these great fortresses resist a direct dragon assault. We might do better to starve them, or to threaten what they value most, Lannisport, the seat of their trade. If we burn Lannisport to the ground, the Lannisters lose wealth, the realm sees the cost of defiance, and the morale shift might be enormous. Rhaenys' gaze flickered. Burn an entire city? Tens of thousands of innocent lives. Aegon's jaw tightened. A terrible possibility, one I do not take lightly, but we are at war with a united continent. We must break their spirit somehow. Visenya stared into the middle distance. Fire and blood, our house words. We must do what is necessary. Rhaenys, more compassionate by nature, said nothing for a long moment. If we do this, we cross a threshold. We become feared and hated by all. We could do it, yes, but once done, we cannot undo it. The city's small folk will perish. Aegon laid a hand on his sister's shoulder. I know. Let us see if there is another way. We will let them see the threat. Perhaps that threat alone will force them to yield. We can approach the city, demand surrender. If they refuse, we show them a taste of dragonfire. If they persist, then the city burns. So the plan was set. The Targaryens advanced on Lannisport in a combined operation. Aegon sailed with a portion of his men down the coast, while Rhaenys and Visenya flew overhead. Along the way, some local lords bent the knee rather than risk incineration, further fracturing the Lannisters' hold on the region. By the time they reached the outskirts of Lannisport, the city's gates were closed, the walls manned by gold and crimson Lannister soldiers. Smoke from the chimneys drifted up into a sky overshadowed by dragons. Tension thrummed in the air. Aegon rode forward under a banner of truce. With him were a dozen knights in Targaryen colors. They halted within earshot of the gates. A herald cried out from the walls, "Who approaches Lannisport?" Aegon reined in his black destrier. Valyrian soared above the city, blotting out the sun in places, his monstrous shape striking terror into those who gazed up. "I am Aegon of House Targaryen," he called. "I come with an offer. Open your gates. Surrender in the name of the Targaryen conquest. Bend the knee and we shall spare the city. We have no wish to spill innocent blood. Defy us and face fire and blood. Your choice." There was silence. Then a figure in gilded armor appeared on the ramparts. Lord Lorien Lannister himself, or so it seemed. His voice was commanding, though edged with desperation. "We swore to the High King. We do not break our oaths. The city stands with House Lannister. If you want it, burn it. Reveal your monstrous nature to the world." Aegon's gut twisted. This was a trap of a different kind. The Lannisters, proud as they were, would not kneel, expecting that the Targaryens would not dare burn so many innocents. Or if they did, it would turn the realm's hatred fully upon them. A hush descended over the field. Then Aegon spoke again, quieter. "I do not wish it. You leave me no choice." He turned his destrier away and rode back to his lines. The gate remained closed. Lannisport's defenders manned the walls. Above, Balerion circled, joined by Meraxes and Vhagar. Rhaenys circled in close, her face grim beneath her helm. Visenya landed briefly, enough to speak to Aegon. "Shall we do it?" Aegon felt every muscle tense. "We will give them one final warning." He spurred his horse forward a second time, stopping at shouting distance. "I call upon Lannisport to evacuate its innocents, if it will not surrender. Send out your women and children. We will give you 1 day's grace. After that, the city will burn." This time, there was no direct reply, only murmurings atop the walls. The day passed in a tense stalemate. When night fell, some small groups began slipping out of the gates, small folk bearing sacks or pushing carts. The Targaryen knights let them pass unmolested. Aegon had no desire to kill fleeing peasants. He hoped that enough would flee to lessen the horror of what might come. Dawn rose, red across the sky, as though an omen of blood. Rhaenys reported that the gates had closed again, and the city's defenders were still determined to resist. Another day passed, then a second. Thousands had fled, but thousands more remained. Lord Lorien showed no sign of yielding. On the third morning, Aegon could delay no longer. The realm watched. If he showed weakness, the alliance would regain confidence. With anguish in his heart, he and his sisters mounted their dragons. The Targaryen knights mustered behind them, keeping a distance, for they did not wish to be caught in the conflagration. With a motion of his hand, Aegon gave the signal. The dragons swooped downward. Lannisport erupted in screams. Balerion unleashed his flames upon the outer wall first, igniting the battlements, forcing archers to scatter. Meraxes soared over the rooftops, setting entire blocks of houses aflame. Vhagar dove in on the harbor, torching ships at anchor. Smoke billowed into the sky. Even from above, the Targaryens could see the chaos below. People running, flames surging between narrow streets, the harbor turning into an inferno of burning vessels. Over the roar of the flames, the dragons bellowed, unleashing wave after wave of dragonfire. Arrows rose feebly from the defenders, but the dragons remained out of scorpion range. Apparently the Lannisters had fewer scorpions here than at Harrenhal. Yet Aegon's heart was lead in his chest. He had chosen this. He had become the Reaver. The city was aflame, and the stench of burning flesh clung to him like an accusation. Eventually, the defenders broke, fleeing into the countryside, or else tried to hide in cellars. The once proud Lannisport was engulfed. Its grand houses and shops turned to ashes. Smoke masked the sky. Aegon ordered a cessation once it was clear the city was broken. The Targaryen forces marched in behind the flames, subdued any remaining resistance, and declared the city under Targaryen rule. Lord Lorien Lannister had apparently fled. Rumors said, perhaps to Casterly Rock. By day's end, Lannisport was a smoldering ruin. Those who lived bore witness to the devastation that dragonfire could wreak. Word would spread across the realm like wildfire. This was the cost of resisting the Targaryens. This was the cost of the new monarchy's defiance. Aegon dismounted among the rubble, the heat of dying embers still thick in the air. Rhaenys stood near him, shaken, her face pale. Visenya showed less emotion, but her lips were pressed thin. Soldiers picked through the wreckage, pulling out survivors or searching for valuables. A hush had fallen, punctuated by the crackling of fires. No joy, no glory, only horror. "We did what we had to do," Visenya said quietly. Rhaenys gave no answer. Aegon gazed about, the acrid smoke stinging his eyes. "Let this be the last city we burn," he murmured. "Perhaps the realm will see now. Bend the knee or perish." The aftermath was as swift as it was brutal. The realm was horrified by Lannisport's destruction. Many in the Alliance cursed the Targaryens as monsters. But fear also swelled. If they could burn Lannisport, what of Old Town, King's Landing, Gulltown, White Harbor? The great houses weighed their next move. Some advocated doubling down, hunting the dragons at any cost. Others argued for negotiation, for who could stand against that kind of devastation? At Harrenhal, High King Roland Tully fumed, sending out new calls to arms. But those calls were met with half-hearted responses in some quarters. The Greyjoys had effectively withdrawn. The Lannisters, battered, clung to pride but had lost Lannisport. The Tyrells worried that Highgarden could be next. The Baratheons faced discontent from their lesser lords. The Martells, always distant, had contributed little to the alliance thus far. The Starks were deep in the Riverlands, but the dragons were nowhere near them. Some banners quietly peeled away, returning home to defend their own. The alliance was fraying. Within a moon's turn of Lannisport's burning, 2 delegations arrived at the Targaryen lines. The first was from House Tyrell, seeking to discuss terms. The second was from House Martell, expressing a desire for neutrality. Aegon received them both with measured courtesy. House Tyrell, through its envoy, indicated a willingness to bend the knee if the Targaryens guaranteed them dominion over the Reach under Targaryen overlordship. The envoy from Dorne, more circumspect, said that if the Targaryens left Dorne well enough alone, House Martell would not stand with the alliance. Aegon, eager to undermine the alliance further, agreed in principle to both. Thus, quietly, 2 major powers slipped out of the High King's coalition. Tully's grand dream of a united Westeros was dying. Encouraged by this shift, Aegon wrote to the Baratheons. He recalled Rhaenys' earlier attempt at negotiation. Now, with Lannisport's example fresh, the Baratheons might see sense. Word came back that House Baratheon wished for a formal parley at Storm's End. Aegon flew there on Balerion, accompanied by Visenya on Vagor. They circled the fortress, but the garrison did not shoot, presumably under orders to avoid a confrontation. Outside the walls, Aegon was met by Lord Baratheon himself and a retinue of knights. There, under a white pavilion, they spoke. The short of it was that Baratheon, too, would bend the knee if Targaryen overlordship recognized the Stormlands as Baratheon territory, with no demands beyond fealty and taxes. Aegon agreed. Another pillar of the alliance was plucked away. The winter that followed saw the alliance crumble. House Arryn, House Lannister, House Stark, and House Tully remained the core, with the Greyjoys officially still in but quietly absent, the Reach, the Stormlands, and Dorne effectively out. The final blow came when the Tullys attempted to enforce unity by calling the banners of the Riverlands. Many refused, worn down by Targaryen raids and afraid to suffer Lannisport's fate. One by one, local lords bent the knee to Aegon, who soared overhead on Balerion, demanding submission. High King Roland Tully found himself with only a fraction of the men he had once commanded. Sensing an opportunity, Aegon marched a larger force into the Riverlands, augmented now by men from the Stormlands and crack cavalry from the Reach. Harrenhal stood as the last bastion of Tully's dream. Aegon dared a second assault, this time with catapults and rams, and with more knowledge of the fortress's weak points from the earlier raid. Visenya and Rhaenys attacked from the sky, while allied ground forces engaged Tully's men outside the walls. In a fierce battle beneath Harrenhal's colossal towers, the Targaryens and their allies wore down the defenders. Though the fortress was strong, morale was not. Some river lords inside the castle surrendered. The Scorpion crews fought on, but eventually the gate was smashed from within by traitors. The Targaryen forces poured in. Valyrian's flames wreaked havoc in the courtyard. Roland Tully was found barricaded in the Great Hall with a handful of loyal knights. He refused to yield. Fighting to the last, he was cut down by a Targaryen knight. His blood stained the black stone floors. At sunset, The Targaryen banner rose above the battlements of Harrenhal, a final symbol of the alliance's demise. Aegon the Conqueror, as men would soon call him, declared the Seven Kingdoms now united under House Targaryen. With Harrenhal fallen, the Lannisters, battered and without their city, soon sued for peace. House Arryn, with no allies left, likewise bent the knee, as did House Stark. The North, so far from the dragon's wrath, had hoped to avoid direct confrontation, but with the realm crumbling around them, they chose fealty over annihilation. One by one, the great lords of Westeros swore oaths to Aegon Targaryen, the first of his name, king of all Westeros, lord of the Seven Kingdoms, and protector of the realm. Though the cost had been high, Lannisport a ruin, many fields burned, thousands dead, Aegon had done what once seemed impossible. He had broken a united Westeros. His dragons, battered but alive, soared above the land as living testament to the new power. In the aftermath, Aegon vowed to rebuild, to bring order to the chaos that war had wrought. Some lords resented him, some feared him, some admired him, but all had learned to bow before the might of House Targaryen. In the end, the question lingered. Had a united Westeros ever truly stood a chance against three dragons? Perhaps yes, if they had stood together in absolute unison, if they had not underestimated the Targaryens' willingness to commit acts of terror like the burning of Lannisport. Perhaps if House Greyjoy had not turned traitor, if the supply lines had held firm, if they had cornered the Targaryen host in a single great battle. 1,000 ifs. But in truth, unity was never easy in Westeros. Old rivalries, ambitions, and fears had undone them as much as Dragonfire. In the end, the realm knelt to the three heads of the dragon, even though that had required an ocean of blood and tears. On the day Aegon was formally crowned at the still smoldering ruins of Harrenhal, kneeling lords arrayed before him, the blackened towers towering overhead, he wore a crown of Valyrian steel with rubies shaped like dragon eyes. Visenya stood at his right, Rhaenys at his left, each holding a dragon banner. The ragged lords, bruised from war, bowed low. Outside, the three dragons roared, their combined voices echoing across the blasted landscape. This was the price of conquest. This was how House Targaryen claimed the Seven Kingdoms, even against a foe that had once stood united. Fire and blood had prevailed, and now a new age would begin. The sun was setting behind Harrenhal's melted towers, painting the waters of the God's Eye with ribbons of dark gold and vermilion. Though the war had ended in a victory for House Targaryen, the reek of burnt flesh and ruined stone clung to the air, refusing to disperse. The once fearsome castle, built by Harren the Black to defy any mortal siege, had become a charred monument to the new reality of Westeros. Dragons ruled where spears and swords had once prevailed. On that day of Aegon's coronation, a hush lay upon the realm as though the land itself was uncertain of its new king. Even those who knelt did so with haunted eyes, remembering the black fires that had devoured Lannisport, the shrieks of those who perished in the scorching streets. In the courtyard of Harrenhal, Aegon stood in front of a makeshift wooden dais. He wore a crown of Valyrian steel and rubies, the metal so dark that it appeared nearly black in the twilight. Pale-haired, tall, and severe in demeanor, he seemed carved from a single piece of hard granite, tested and tempered by the trials of his conquest. At his side stood his sisters, Visenya and Rhaenys, each still dressed in their leathers and mail, as though the war were not truly ended. Their dragons roost beyond the walls. Balerion, the Black Dread, Vagor, greenish and scarred. Meraxes, silver-scaled and swift. Smoke curled from each beast's nostrils, coiling in the autumn air. The courtyard was filled with lords and ladies, some battered from recent battles, others trembling in fear or uncertain excitement. There were Lannisters, their golden hair dulled by road dust and heartbreak over the sacking of Lannisport. There were Baratheons, stoic-faced after having chosen to align with Aegon rather than suffer a similar fate. The Tyrells, newly sworn, their heads lowered as they acknowledged the might of dragons above the fertile fields of the Reach. Even House Martell had sent a small delegation, lurking on the periphery, keen to gauge how much autonomy their neutrality might earn them under this new regime. Most of all, there were the Riverlords, those who had once rallied behind King Roland Tully, who now lay dead somewhere in the depths of Harrenhal. Their eyes were heavy with defeat and the shattered dreams of a unified kingdom that had not lasted out the year. Aegon spoke with the measured calm that was becoming his trademark. "Lords of Westeros, you have fought bravely, you have lost dearly, so have we all. Now the war is ended. I stand before you not as a foreign conqueror, but as your king. The 7 kingdoms shall be united under House Targaryen, under dragons, yes, but also under law and justice. Let no more blood be spilled. Let no more innocence burn. Kneel here and rise as loyal vassals of the crown. Refuse, and you know what fate befalls those who defy Dragonfire." His voice echoed off the blackened masonry. One by one, the lords of Westeros stepped forward to kneel. The great houses that had long since yielded, Baratheon, Tyrell, Greyjoy, Martell, were confirmed in their titles. The Lannisters, battered but proud, surrendered in the name of the realm, ceding Lannisport's smoldering remains. House Aegon, their knights scattered and demoralized, bowed likewise. The North, through a solemn envoy of Stark bannermen, proffered fealty in a short, blunt declaration of loyalty. There would be no more grand alliance to resist the dragon. Westeros was Aegon's. That night, a lavish feast was held in the vast, echoing great hall of Harrenhal, though lavish was a relative term. So many corners of the fortress still bore the scars of Dragonfire. Entire wings collapsed into molten ruin. The lords and ladies dined on what remained from the campaign's provisions: salted meat, dried fruits, fresh game from the nearby forests. There was no mood for exuberance. People ate quietly, offering stiff toasts to the new king. Flames flickered in iron braziers, reflecting in the eyes of the watchers. Musicians played softly, but the music did little to lift the pall that hung over the hall like a funerary shroud. At Aegon's table, near the dais, sat the newly formed inner council that had begun to coalesce around him. Visenya on his right, Rhaenys on his left, Orys Baratheon next to Rhaenys, a lesser Targaryen cousin who had served as a fleet commander, a Tyrell cousin recommended for financial matters, and even a learned scribe from Old Town who had thrown his lot in with the Targaryens. They spoke in hushed tones about the future, how to govern a realm of such size and diversity, how to quell rebellions before they could form, how to raise revenue from a land ravaged by war. Rhaenys leaned in toward Aegon and murmured, "We must do something to ease the small folks' suffering. The fields are burned in the Crownlands, the Riverlands are battered, and Lannisport, gods, an entire city in ashes. If we do not act, famine and despair will breed hatred. They might see us as tyrants." Aegon's pale eyes flickered in the torchlight. "Am I not a tyrant already, sister? I burned a city when its lord refused to yield." Rhaenys' expression was pained. "We did what we felt we must, but let us show now a kinder hand. You will lose nothing by offering relief, by feeding the hungry. Indeed, you may gain the goodwill of many. Fear holds the realm in thrall, but mercy can cement loyalty." Visenya, listening, gave a faint snort. "Mercy has its place, but weakness invites rebellion. They must see that we are strong, that we do not tolerate defiance. They already see that." Rhaenys gestured around the hall, where the lords sat subdued. "Let them also see a king who understands that burned fields breed only bitterness." Aegon nodded slowly. "Yes, we shall pass an edict. For the next year, taxes will be eased for those lands most afflicted by the war. We will distribute food from our own stores to the worst-hit areas. It will not repair everything, but it might keep thousands alive. Let it be known that I do not rule simply by fire and blood, but by a desire to see this realm flourish." So was planted the seed of Aegon's approach to governance, forging a balance between the raw power of Dragonfire and the measured compassion needed to hold a kingdom together. Over the coming weeks, the new king held audiences in Harrenhal's Blackened Halls, officially confirming titles, negotiating the shape of the new order. Many believed he would choose Harrenhal as his seat, for it was the largest castle in the realm. But the place was a ruin in many ways, haunted by ghosts of war and the curses of Harren the Black. Aegon had something else in mind. King's Landing, a modest site near the Blackwater close to Dragonstone, where the Targaryen fleet could easily supply him. It was rumored that he intended to raise a brand new city there, a seat from which dragons might watch over the entire realm. But that dream was for the future. In the short term, Aegon dispatched loyal men to oversee each of the 7 kingdoms. Orys Baratheon, considered almost a brother to Aegon, took charge of the Crownlands as a justiciar and war leader. The Tyrells, in exchange for having bent the knee early, were confirmed as Wardens of the South and Overlords of the Reach. The Lannisters, though humiliated, retained Casterly Rock, but they would have to rebuild Lannisport if they wanted to recapture their mercantile glory. The Arryns were given wide autonomy in the Vale, though Aegon insisted they keep their gates open to trade and pay proper fealty to the Iron Throne he intended to establish. The Starks, distant, proud, and untested in the final throes of the war, remained in Winterfell, recognized as Wardens of the North. The Greyjoys, slippery as ever, retreated to their islands, satisfied with the new arrangement that promised them a measure of autonomy. And the Martells, behind their deserts and mountains, quietly observed from Sunspear, paying their taxes when asked but otherwise untouched by war. In those early months of Targaryen rule, the biggest question was whether the realm would stay obedient now that the threat of immediate dragonfire had receded. Some lords nursed grudges, stinging from the memory of Lannisport's ruin. Others, particularly younger knights, muttered in taverns that they should have rallied for one last stand, that the dragons could be slain with enough scorpions and cunning. Aegon's watchers brought him rumors of plots and hidden conspiracies. Yet no open rebellions flared. The memory of Harrenhal's melted towers and Lannisport's ashes was still too fresh. As winter's chill settled over the land, the Targaryens began to implement a more structured rule. The Painted Table, once at Dragonstone, was transferred to Harrenhal temporarily so that Aegon's council could pore over the details of the realm's geography. Rhaenys took it upon herself to coordinate relief for those areas that had been ravaged by war. Shipments of grain from the Reach, fish from the Vale's coasts, salted meats from the Stormlands, all distributed under the auspices of the new king. Visenya, by contrast, focused on reorganizing the royal army, integrating disbanded soldiers from various regions, establishing loyal garrisons in key forts, and ensuring that scorpions and anti-dragon weaponry were confiscated or destroyed. Neither she nor Aegon had any intention of letting any lord keep the means to kill a dragon, not after the near-disaster at Harrenhal's first assault. Meanwhile, Aegon spent time meeting individually with the great lords who had come to heal. He aimed to forge personal bonds of respect where possible. With the Baratheons, he found camaraderie. Orys had always been a friend, and the Stormlords, though fierce, had bent early enough to avoid the worst. The Tyrells boasted of their green fields and wealth, slyly reminding Aegon that House Gardner had once been kings in the Reach. Aegon recognized the unspoken threat. If the Tyrells felt slighted, they might dream of the old throne of Highgarden. To pacify them, he spoke of roads to connect the Reach to King's Landing, an expansion of trade that would line everyone's pockets. The Lannisters, for their part, seethed beneath smiles. Though they had no city left to defend, they still possessed gold mines. Aegon made it clear that if they wanted to rebuild Lannisport into a glorious port once more, the crown would give its blessing and support. Any attempt at insurrection, however, would be met with the same dragonfire that had undone them before. The Lannisters bowed, stony-faced. As for the Starks, little was heard from Winterfell in that first winter of Aegon's reign. Their envoys arrived, curtly reaffirming fealty, paying the taxes. Word was that Lord Stark had returned north in ill spirits after the war, unwilling to venture south again unless commanded. The snows had begun to fall in the neck, making travel arduous. Aegon was content to leave the north to itself for a time, so long as the direwolves remained quiet. It was in midwinter, amid the torchlit gloom of Harrenhal's main hall, that Rhaenys brought troubling news to Aegon. "There is a new rumor spreading," she told him, voice pitched low. "In taverns and caravans across the land, men say that the Targaryens have no rightful claim here, that we are foreigners who took Westeros by terror, and that the war is not truly over. They claim that the Seven themselves, or the old gods, or the Lord of Light, or some other deity, depending on who you speak to, will raise a champion to cast us down. Aegon frowned. Such rumors are to be expected. Conquest does not wash away centuries of tradition in a single year. True, Rhaenys said. But some of these rumors carry a more tangible threat. Stories of a hidden heir to House Tully or House Lannister. Biding time. Whispers of militant faith sects that condemn us as abominations. Valyrian usurpers who ride creatures of hellfire. Visenya entered the hall at that moment, her expression mirroring Aegon's own dark concern. We cannot stamp out rumors by force alone, or we risk fueling martyrdom. We should address it with cunning. We can best handle the faith by appealing to the High Septon in Old Town, offering to reaffirm the realm's devotion. The faith hates heresy more than foreigners. If we are pious enough in our public stance, perhaps they will not call for holy war. Aegon drummed his fingers on the arm of his chair. I have no love for zealots, but we need the faith. The small folk cling to its teachings. If the High Septon blesses my rule, many may hush their complaints. Let us send an envoy to Old Town, someone who can speak gently without stoking fear. We can do it, Rhaenys volunteered. Meraxes and I can fly there, but I'll land well outside the city walls and proceed humbly on horseback. Let them see that we mean respect. Visenya made a quiet harumph, but she nodded. I prefer to show our might openly, but in this case Rhaenys is right. We must reassure the faith. And Old Town is no friend to House Lannister or Tully, so it might be easier than we fear. So Rhaenys went. She carried with her letters sealed in black wax, each bearing Aegon's promise to uphold the sanctity of the faith of the Seven and to govern with justice, not cruelty. She also brought gifts. Embroidered vestments for the High Septon, golden chalices encrusted with rubies, relics from Valyrian craftsmanship that would dazzle the hearts of any grand temple. When she landed Meraxes on the open fields north of Old Town, she took pains to remain there, letting the local watch approach her. She announced that she came in peace, seeking only audience with the High Septon. In time, she was escorted to the city gates, still accompanied by Meraxes at a distance. Though the city's denizens trembled at the sight of the silver dragon, they saw no fire raining down from the sky. Some came forth to gape in awe or cross themselves in fear. Rhaenys, wearing only light armor, rode with head unhelmed, silver-gold hair streaming, to show she was no monstrous conqueror, only a queenly envoy. Her negotiations with the High Septon lasted a fortnight behind closed doors. Rumors flew about whether Rhaenys had threatened to burn the Starry September if the faith did not comply. Others whispered that she seduced the High Septon with gifts and flattery. In truth, Rhaenys used diplomacy honed by years of reading, traveling, and witnessing the heartbreak of war. She appealed to the faith's desire for stability. Did the High Septon wish to see more suffering among the small folk? Did he wish to risk a war of zeal that the faith could not possibly win against dragons? Rhaenys also promised land grants to the septs, promised the building of new septs in the war-torn areas, and pledged that the Targaryens would fund almshouses for widows and orphans. In return, the High Septon would bless King Aegon's reign and call upon the faithful to lay down their arms. He would also forbid the spread of heretical talk about Targaryens being demons in human skin. By the end, an accord was reached. When Rhaenys departed Old Town, the bells of the Starry September rang in a formal blessing. The faith might not love the Targaryens, but they had chosen to coexist. Word spread across the realm. The High Septon recognized Aegon as the rightful king, so who were lesser folk to say otherwise? The rumor of holy war receded, though pockets of extremism persisted. With the faith no longer poised to oppose him, Aegon's position was strengthened immeasurably. Meanwhile, Visenya attended to the realm's martial affairs. She flew over the Westerlands and the Reach, ensuring that no hidden caches of scorpion bolts or dangerous weaponry remained. Each time she visited a lord's domain, she inspected their armories, had her retinue measure the size of their standing forces, and quietly took note of which houses grumbled behind her back. The Lannisters, outwardly compliant, were suspected of harboring resentments. She found no overt contraband in Casterly Rock, but plenty of stony stairs. If the Lannisters dreamed of revenge, they were wise enough not to reveal it so soon. The Riverlands were more subdued. House Tully, bereft of its once kingly ambition, had become a lesser power, overshadowed by the knowledge that Harrenhal and Riverrun had both been ravaged. The new head of House Tully was a distant cousin of Roland Tully, more an administrator than a warrior. He bent the knee meekly. It was in the Vale that Visenya encountered a flicker of resistance. The Arryns had sworn fealty, but some mountain clans refused to acknowledge foreign overlords. They raided supply caravans moving through the mountain passes, cutting down Targaryen outriders. Visenya decided to make an example of them. Mounting Vagor, she soared into the heights, where the clans hid among the rocky outcrops. She unleashed dragonfire on their largest encampments, scattering them in terror. Those who survived either fled deeper into the mountains or surrendered. Lord Arryn expressed gratitude, for those same clans had vexed the Vale for centuries. Visenya's show of strength in the heights helped secure Targaryen authority, at least for the moment. In the north, quiet watchers reported that Lord Stark had begun building up fortifications along the neck. Why, none could say for certain. Some believed the Starks simply wished to guard against any further southern wars. Others whispered that the north might yet break away if the realm sank into chaos again. For now, the Starks remained nominally loyal. Aegon, unwilling to spark fresh conflict, sent envoys north, bearing warm furs and polite letters. Let the north keep its ways, so long as it paid its taxes and raised no army. The envoys reported no hostility at Winterfell, only a cold courtesy matching the Stark winter winds. Thus passed the first year of Targaryen rule. The realm was battered, uncertain, but at peace. A year became two, and in that time small signs of rebuilding took place. Lannisport began to see reconstruction under Lannister coin, guided by stonemasons from the Reach. King's Landing, the site chosen by Aegon, was slowly transforming from a fishing village into a bustling town. Timber, stone, and laborers poured in, financed partly by wealth seized in the war, partly by new trade arrangements with the free cities. Work began on a rudimentary royal keep near the Blackwater, and though it was no castle like Harrenhal or the Rock, the presence of dragons overhead gave it a majesty all its own. Merchants from Essos found it convenient to dock near King's Landing, dealing with Targaryen officials who levied tolls and taxes for the crown's coffers. Gradually, the settlement grew, messy and sprawling, attracting all manner of folk: opportunists, traders, thieves, sellswords, exiles, and hopeful peasants. It was no shining capital yet, but the seeds of what might become a great city had been planted. Aegon traveled often between Harrenhal and King's Landing, orchestrating matters of state. His sisters divided tasks. Rhaenys focusing on building alliances, Visenya on ensuring military discipline, Aegon himself splitting his attention among diplomacy, justice, and the forging of a new royal administration. He instituted a royal treasury, overseen by stewards loyal to House Targaryen, with the Tyrell cousins serving as master of coin. A new title was created, Hand of the King, bestowed upon Orys Baratheon for his unwavering loyalty and strong sense of practical governance. Orys took up residence in King's Landing, overseeing day-to-day matters while Aegon was away. The realm, so recently at war, began to find a fragile equilibrium. Yet not all was calm. One crisp morning in the third year of Aegon's reign, a messenger from the Westerlands came galloping into the gates of King's Landing, cloak dusty and eyes wild. He demanded an audience with the king. When Aegon met him in the half-finished hall that served as a throne room, the messenger fell to his knees, breath heaving. "My lord, my king, bandits. An uprising near the borders of the Reach and the Westerlands. They are calling themselves the Lion's Claw, claiming to fight for the rightful Lannister king who never bent the knee. They raid villages, kill Targaryen supporters, and vanish into the hills." Aegon frowned. "And House Lannister? Have they done nothing to stop these bandits?" The messenger swallowed. "They claim to be sending men, but progress is slow. Some whisper that the bandits are aided by lesser Lannister cousins, or by knights still harboring grudges. The local folk say these raiders wear lion badges, speak of avenging Lannisport. Aegon dismissed the messenger with a solemn nod, then summoned his council. "We must treat this as a serious threat," he said. "If the Lannisters are turning a blind eye, we must assume complicity at some level. We cannot afford pockets of rebellion. The bandits might inspire others to rise." Orys Baratheon stood with arms crossed. "I can lead a punitive expedition west, tear out this lion's claw by the roots." Rhaenys exchanged a glance with Visenya. "That may be exactly what the rebels want. A direct Targaryen army in the Westerlands, which could rile up the local lords. We might see open revolt if we're too heavy-handed." Aegon's face was grim. "We cannot let it fester either. Let us see which lords in the Westerlands remain truly loyal. I'll send a raven to the Lannisters, demanding they deal with these rebels swiftly, or else we shall intervene ourselves. If they fail, I will ride Balerion west. Let them see the threat in clear daylight." The raven was sent, and the Lannisters replied with curt assurances that they were dealing with the problem. Over the next few weeks, conflicting reports trickled back. The bandits had sacked a small village aligned with House Targaryen, leaving the charred bodies of peasants pinned with notes that read, "Remember Lannisport. A group of Lannister knights did clash with the rebels, though rumor held that the knights mysteriously withdrew at the last moment, allowing the rebels to escape. More and more, it seemed that House Lannister's loyalty was not absolute." Aegon bided his time building a case. Finally, news reached him that the bandits had begun extorting local septs, forcibly seizing grain and silver meant for the faith. That was the final straw. Not only were they defying the crown, but they were stealing from the faith. Aegon prepared to march. Orys raised 1,000 men from the Crownlands, plus 500 sellswords newly in Targaryen pay. Visenya decided to join them with Vhagar, while Rhaenys would remain in King's Landing to manage affairs there. Aegon took Balerion, eager to show the Westerlands that his power was not diminished by time or distance. They traveled by land, stopping briefly at Harrenhal to gather more supplies. The devastation from the war still lingered in the Riverlands. Fields left fallow, half-empty villages. But signs of recovery were there too. Thatched roofs repaired, new fences built. The small folk eyed Aegon's host warily, but seeing no threat from the Targaryen banners, they mostly kept to themselves. In time, the host reached the border of the Westerlands. The hills rose around them, dotted with pines and crags. Aegon dispatched scouts, warning them to be alert for ambushes. Meanwhile, Visenya took to the sky on Vhagar, scanning for rebel camps. The bandits could hide among the ridges, but they had little recourse against a dragon overhead, save to scurry like mice. What Visenya found was troubling. Multiple villages had been razed, presumably for supporting Targaryen taxes. She also spotted camps of armed men moving in small parties. They wore no uniform beyond scraps of red and gold, yet they flaunted lion sigils on improvised banners. It was a classic insurgency, capitalizing on the still raw hatred over Lannisport's destruction. Though not large enough to face a royal army in open battle, they could harass supply lines, kill tax collectors, terrorize local Targaryen supporters. If left unchecked, they might spark a greater conflagration. At last, near a ravine crisscrossed by a shallow river, Aegon's host encountered a rebel force, perhaps 300 men, scattered among the rocks. Their leader, wearing battered armor, once dyed a brilliant crimson. Aegon halted his main column out of arrow range, letting Visenya do a swift pass overhead with Vhagar. The rebels shot arrows uselessly into the sky, some brandishing makeshift spears. Visenya unleashed a gust of flame, scorching a patch of brush and forcing them to scatter. Aegon, flanked by Orys, advanced with a contingent of knights to parley. The rebel leader, to everyone's surprise, stepped forward unarmed, hands raised. He was a gaunt man with a scarred face, who introduced himself as Ser Harwin Hill, a Lannister bastard from some lesser branch of the family. Harwin's voice carried the raw edge of desperation. "Your Grace, I come before you with no illusions. We cannot defeat dragons. But know this, we fight because your conquest took everything from us. Our homes burned, our families slaughtered at Lannisport. Some of us had no part in the war's decisions, yet we paid the price in blood and fire. So we raise arms not to gain crowns, but to avenge the dead, to strike at your rule in whatever way we can. Aegon studied him with cold eyes. And what is your demand? Harwin barked a harsh laugh. Demand? We demand no more savage taxes, no more dragon oversight, an end to the tyranny that burned an entire city. We demand restitution for the lives lost. But we know we'll not get it from you. Visenya, from atop her horse, spoke sharply. You are outlaws. You threaten the king's peace. Is it restitution to kill small folk loyal to the crown, to destroy villages that had no part in Lannisport's ruin? The rebel's face twisted. War is war. Are we any worse than the men who burned families alive? If we are outlaws, then you are butchers. But enough talk. We will not kneel. He lifted his voice. Lion's claw. Prepare to fight or die free. With that, the rebels scrambled back among the rocks. Aegon sighed wearily. He had heard such words before, the raw anger of those who had suffered. He turned to Orys. Send in the archers. Spare who you can if they surrender. Then he mounted Balerion, soared into the air. Vhagar followed, both dragons circling high. The rebels below scattered like ants, but they could not outrun arrow volleys or the momentum of 1,000 disciplined foot. Some fought desperately. A handful died heroically trying to bring down Targaryen knights, but most were cut down or captured within the hour. Ser Harwin Hill, ironically, survived, wounded and pinned beneath a fallen comrade. Orys had him dragged before Aegon, battered and bleeding. Execute him, Visenya said. Let it serve as an example. Aegon gazed down at the bastard knight. Harwin's eyes were fierce with defiance, though pain twisted his features. The new king felt something stir in his chest, an echo of that guilt and sorrow from Lannisport. Did the realm truly need another grisly display? Yet he knew mercy might embolden rebels who saw a chance to defy him. Slowly he shook his head. Lock him in chains, Aegon said at last. He will face trial. If found guilty of murder and treason, then the law will do its work. Visenya's lips thinned, but she made no protest. Justice would be served, but not in a blind spasm of vengeance. Over the next few weeks, Aegon's host tracked down other pockets of the Lion's Claw. Some surrendered upon seeing the dragons overhead, others fought to the death. House Lannister's banners appeared intermittently, offering belated assistance. Lord Lannister himself emerged from Casterly Rock, disclaiming all knowledge of these rebels and pledging loyalty to Aegon. Yet the half-hearted nature of his support did not go unnoticed. Aegon made a mental note that the Lannisters still harbored resentment that might flare again in the future. Once the Lion's Claw was broken, Aegon returned to King's Landing with his prisoners. Before the partially finished royal keep, he held open trials. Witnesses recounted atrocities committed by the rebels. The rebels, in turn, spoke bitterly of the atrocities wrought by House Targaryen. After deliberation, Aegon passed sentence. Most of the ringleaders, including Ser Harwin Hill, were executed by beheading. Their lesser followers, many of whom had been coerced or were simply trying to survive in ravaged lands, were either sent to the wall at the Stark's acceptance or conscripted into forced labor building roads for the crown. The message was clear. Aegon would show some measure of clemency, but those who took up arms against the throne could not expect to walk free. As year 3 of Aegon's reign melted into year 4, the realm moved beyond the immediate aftermath of war. Trade began to flow more freely, aided by Aegon's new roads and the establishment of royal checkpoints that protected merchants. The Faith, though uneasy with Targaryen dragon lords, found advantage in cooperating with the crown, receiving grants to rebuild septs in ravaged areas. Harvests in the Reach were bountiful, and shipments of grain eased hunger across the land. Lannisport's reconstruction advanced slowly, with new piers and rebuilt warehouses. The West would take a generation to fully recover, but each small step counted. In King's Landing, The foundations of the Red Keep were laid, massive stones hauled by barge up the Blackwater. Aegon envisioned a fortress from which House Targaryen could watch over the entire continent, ringed by thick walls and towers shaped to accommodate dragons. Yet simmering tensions remained. In the Riverlands, local lords still grumbled about the burden of stationing Targaryen garrisons at their keeps. In Dorne, House Martell had largely escaped the war, retaining near-total independence within the wider realm. Some Stormlanders muttered that if Dorne did not pay the same taxes, the arrangement was unfair. Meanwhile, in the Vale, distant rumors spoke of a charismatic rogue knight proclaiming that the Targaryens had offended the gods, urging a crusade. The knight's name was Ser Brynden Hurston, rumored to be an anointed knight with a flair for rousing speeches. Few took him seriously at first, but such men had a way of gathering followers among the desperate. And beyond the Neck, the North watched with quiet skepticism, as though expecting the realm to tear itself apart again under a foreign king. Aegon saw all these cracks in the foundation of his new order. He worked tirelessly, issuing edicts, traveling with his sisters to quell disputes, forging alliances through marriages between lesser Targaryen cousins and noble Westerosi houses. He was no fool. He knew the only real guarantee of his power was that the realm feared or respected the dragons. But fear alone was fleeting. The scars of Lannisport and Harrenhal showed that terror could unite men against him if it smoldered long enough. So he sought stability through prosperity, hoping that a well-fed, profit-making realm would have less appetite for rebellion. Bread and justice, he would say to his council. That is the surest way to keep the realm. Feed them, treat them fairly, and they will not risk the flames of our dragons. Still, from time to time, Aegon wondered if there would come a day when dragons were not enough. He pondered whether the realm might outgrow the memory of the conquest. The faith had been mollified, but faith could turn on a coin if a new voice of zeal took the sept's seat. Likewise, if the great houses ever truly set aside their rivalries and found a champion. But that was the path that had been tried. They had come together under King Roland Tully, yet still they had lost. Aegon reminded himself of that whenever dark thoughts gnawed at him. Year 5 dawned with a new worry, a plague creeping into the ports of Westeros from Essos. Called the Red Flux, it caused fever, coughing of blood, and a swift death in many cases. King's Landing, as a growing trade hub, was especially vulnerable. Ships from Lys, Pentos, and Tyrosh brought exotic goods, and, it seemed, disease. The city had no real walls or sewers yet, so filth piled up in the streets, water was drawn from questionable sources, and fleas and rats flourished. Before long, rumors circulated that men and women were dying by the dozens in the dockside districts. The city reeled from panic, with some families fleeing back into the countryside. The sight of new houses going up was overshadowed by funeral pyres. Aegon's advisors whispered that the city might become a graveyard if the plague was not contained. The king took swift action. He ordered a quarantine of incoming ships, establishing a plague house on the outskirts where those showing symptoms could be taken. This was a radical step, one some lords thought cruel, locking the sick away in a hastily built compound. But Aegon, guided partly by his experience of war's horrors and by the council of maesters who understood disease, saw no better choice. He recruited healers from Old Town, paying them handsomely to tend to the stricken. Rhaenys personally visited the plague house, bringing gifts of fresh water, bandages, and supplies to those quarantined within. She wore a linen mask over her face, mindful of how contagion might spread. The people, frightened and suffering, were at least somewhat reassured to see a dragon rider come among them with empathy rather than fire. Despite these measures, the Red Flux took a grim toll. Hundreds died in King's Landing, hundreds more in Gulltown and other ports. Some lesser houses were nearly wiped out when the disease reached their enclaves. The Targaryens themselves were spared. Some said dragonlords were immune to lesser plagues. Others said they simply avoided close contact with the infected. Aegon had wards posted at the gates, controlling movement. Construction on the Red Keep slowed. Trade dipped sharply. The realm hovered at the edge of crisis again, this time from a foe that no blade or flame could simply burn away. As the plague raged, whispers of doom spread among the small folk. Some claimed that the red flux was the gods' retribution for Lannisport. Others said it was the result of unnatural magic from Valyria, punishment for letting dragon-blooded foreigners rule the continent. The faith preached that the pious who prayed would be spared, and enough were spared that the faith's influence grew. Aegon turned once more to the High Septon, calling for official statements that the plague was not a sign of the Targaryens' damnation but a test for all the faithful. The High Septon obliged, though with a subtle undercurrent that piety could indeed avert further curses. That arrangement suited Aegon well enough. Let the people pray so long as they did not blame the crown for the plague. By early autumn, the red flux receded almost as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving thousands dead but the realm still intact. As commerce resumed, Aegon declared a period of mourning for the plague's victims, ordering that no taxes be levied from plague-ravaged districts for half a year. He also announced that the crown would finance a better system of wells and waste disposal in King's Landing to reduce the chance of future epidemics. It was an ambitious plan, hampered by corruption and limited knowledge of sanitation, but it marked one of the first attempts to systematically improve living conditions in what was becoming Westeros's new capital. The small folk took note, and while they might never love the Targaryens as rescuers, they saw that this king was not blind to their plight. The plague's end coincided with a significant royal announcement. Aegon would take a public tour of the Seven Kingdoms to demonstrate unity and quell lingering tensions. He planned to visit the Vale, the North, the Iron Islands, the Westerlands, the Reach, and Dorne. The last was particularly interesting, for no Targaryen had yet set foot in Sunspear. House Martell had been effectively an observer, paying token homage but not truly integrated. Perhaps this royal progress would encourage them to accept a closer bond, or reveal if they harbored seditious intentions. Visenya, eager as ever to assert the Targaryen presence, volunteered to accompany Aegon for part of this tour. Rhaenys, by contrast, wished to remain at King's Landing, furthering construction on the keep and ensuring that local governance ran smoothly. So it was decided, Aegon and Visenya would take Balerion and Vhagar, along with a retinue of nearly 1,000 men on horseback, traveling region by region to show the crown's face to the people. Orys Baratheon would oversee the crownlands in their absence, with Rhaenys supporting him. A substantial garrison, including mercenaries from the free cities, was left behind to deter any opportunistic rebellion. They set forth just as the leaves were turning gold and red. Autumn in the Vale was a wonder to behold, the towering mountains capped with early snow, the valleys glowing in the crisp sunlight. Visenya soared overhead on Vhagar, scanning the passes, while Aegon rode below with his mounted guard. Lord Arryn greeted them cordially at the Bloody Gate, presenting them with gifts of falcons and rare mountain spices. The Arryn men seemed genuinely relieved that no dragons attacked them this time. Some small folk lined the roads, curious to see the famed conquerors. A few jeered or spat as the retinue passed, but no violence erupted, and overall the Vale remained calm. Aegon toured the area itself, marveling at the fortress perched on a giant spire of stone. Visenya circled around the heights on Vhagar, demonstrating how a dragon might bypass even those lofty walls. The Arryns accepted the pointed hint with forced smiles. In the courtyard, a modest ceremony took place where Lord Arryn reaffirmed his loyalty and offered a daughter or niece for a Targaryen marriage if it might please the king. Aegon, aware that he already had sisters who were his queens and mindful of avoiding new tangles, politely declined. The Arryns did not press the matter. Despite the Vale's earlier attempts to unify against him, there was no appetite now for more strife. Next, the royal progress ventured north, crossing the neck at Moat Cailin. The Starks had prepared a subdued but respectful welcome. The north was entering the early throes of winter, though the harshest season had not yet arrived in full force. Aegon found Winterfell imposing. Thick walls, hot springs warming the castle from within, a sense of ancient tradition radiating from every stone. Lord Stark, a grave-faced man named Torrhen Stark, greeted them with stoic courtesy. He offered the hospitality of his great hall, where the smell of roasting boar and spiced wine filled the air. Aegon and Visenya noted the presence of many stern-faced northern lords, presumably there to see this Dragon King in the flesh. Though none openly challenged him, their eyes held an aloof caution. One evening, after a feast in the hall, Aegon and Lord Stark walked alone in the Godswood, the bare branches rattling overhead in the cold wind. The weirwood's red leaves had fallen, leaving only pale bark. Stark's breath steamed as he spoke quietly. "Many in the north feel we gained little from kneeling to you. We lost men in the Southern War, and for what? We remain distant, with no real threat upon us but the taxes we now pay." Aegon did not react with anger, only mild interest. "And how do you feel, Lord Stark?" The Northman exhaled. "I bent the knee to spare my people the fate of Lannisport. I see no shame in that. We cannot fight dragons. But I will not pretend that my folk welcome foreign rule. Many in the north yearn for their own kings again. We keep them in line because we see no advantage in rebellion. But if the day comes when the Targaryens appear weak, my lords may recall they once wore crowns." Aegon nodded slowly, the words a cold gust across his heart. "Thank you for your honesty. I understand your people's pride. But as you have said, dragons do not fade easily. I aim to give you no cause for rebellion. If the North keeps faith, it shall remain secure in its traditions." They parted with an uneasy truce of understanding. Aegon spent the rest of his time in the north inspecting the local defenses, enthralled by the vastness of the frozen moors. Visenya flew overhead, glimpsing the high passes into the distant lands beyond the wall. She reported that the wall was an immense barrier of ice, manned by the black-clad Night's Watch. The Watch's leaders greeted the Targaryens stiffly. They had little interest in politics, only in their ancient duty. A quick exchange of courtesies, and Visenya departed. She mused to Aegon that the realm might one day need a strong monarchy if some threat emerged from the icy wastes beyond. But for now, the Watch seemed content to remain aloof. From the north, the royal progress turned back southward, crossing the neck once more, then heading west to visit the Iron Islands. Aegon was especially curious about the Ironborn, who had aided him passively by withdrawing their fleet at a critical time. The isles proved bleak and windswept, dotted with craggy hills and rocky shores. Lord Sport on Pike was a cramped settlement overshadowed by the fortress of House Greyjoy. Lord Greyjoy, a rangy, sea-weathered man named Drummond Greyjoy, welcomed them with more enthusiasm than the Starks had shown, as though hoping to gain further privileges under Targaryen rule. Yet the worship of the drowned god and the Ironborn's reaving culture clashed with the faith of the Seven. Aegon found the place rife with potential instability, especially if the Ironborn ever decided that paying taxes to a Dragon King limited their plundering. For now, though, they cooperated, eager to keep Aegon's favor. One night, after a meager feast of fish and seaweed bread, Lord Greyjoy took Aegon aside. "Your Grace, we have not forgotten how we kept our fleet from opposing you. Perhaps we can be granted official license to raid the coasts of Essos? That might keep the men's hunger for plunder sated, and earn us gold to pay our taxes more easily." Aegon eyed him, remembering how precarious it was to let the Ironborn run wild. He decided on a cautious approach. "As long as you do not raid Westerosi coasts or the ships of Westeros's allies, I will not forbid you from sailing east. But if I hear that your reavers have attacked my subjects or allies, Dragonfire will come to Pike." Lord Greyjoy bowed, but a calculating gleam lingered in his eyes. The Ironborn might obey for a while, but Aegon doubted that old habits would vanish overnight. Next, the royal progress continued on to the Westerlands, where Aegon spent time in the newly rebuilt parts of Lannisport. Smoke still rose from some of the ruined quarters. However, new foundations and streets were taking shape under a flurry of masons and laborers. House Lannister put on a show of welcoming the king, with feasts, tournaments, and lavish gifts. Aegon accepted them politely, while Visenya soared overhead with Vagor, a reminder that they still remembered the Lion's Claw uprising. Lord Lannister introduced Aegon to many lesser knights who had proven their loyalty in stamping out the rebel bandits. Some had scars to show for their efforts. Yet as the courtiers danced and drank, Aegon and Visenya sensed an undercurrent of tension. Some eyes followed them with barely concealed malice. The memory of burning never truly faded, and the Lannisters were proud. Still, they dared not openly defy the crown. Aegon left with an uneasy sense of having forced a brittle peace upon them, one that might crack if a new opportunity arose. Finally, Aegon guided his retinue south to the Reach for a short visit, checking on the Tyrells and ensuring the flow of grain was steady. The wide fields and orchards seemed to flourish with a bounty that overshadowed the war's scars. The Tyrells were gracious hosts, plying Aegon with sweet wines, honeyed pastries, and tours of their scenic farmland. They boasted of how shipments from Highgarden had fed the crownlands, reminding Aegon that their wealth and loyalty were pivotal to his rule. The king responded by granting them new trade privileges and praising their stewardship. All the while, Visenya hovered in the background, assessing the Tyrell knights' readiness. She found them well-organized, well-fed, and proud, but no signs suggested imminent rebellion. They had found contentment in being the realm's breadbasket and influential advisors at court. If there was a threat to the Targaryen monarchy, it would not likely come from the Reach at present. The last stop was Dorne, the realm's southern frontier that had largely evaded the war's ravages. The approach required crossing the Dornish Marches, a region historically contested by Stormlanders and Dornish. Aegon traveled with caution, for the desert climate and the cunning of House Martell were famous. Unlike the other regions, Dorne had never been truly conquered. Rather, it had sworn a loose fealty after Aegon's victory, paying minimal taxes and mostly keeping to itself. The scorpions that had threatened the dragons in other regions might exist in Dorne as well, hidden in the wadis and mountain passes. Visenya was vigilant, flying overhead to scout. But they encountered no open hostilities, only the occasional watchful eyes of mounted Dornish patrols who led them warily towards Sunspear. Sunspear itself rose from the harsh red sands by the sea, a fortress of slender towers and white walls that glowed hot under the sun. House Martell's sigil, the sun and spear, adorned the banners flapping in the sea breeze. Prince Corin Martell, Dorne's ruler, styled himself prince, not lord, greeted Aegon with a calm, measured politeness. He was a tall man with sun-dark skin and sharp black eyes, wearing flowing silks and sandals. At his side stood a sister, Princess Dyria, who studied Aegon and Visenya with equal parts curiosity and wariness. Dornish courtiers lingered about, wearing loose robes and bright sashes, their gazes unreadable behind veils or headscarves. It was a land of subtlety, far from the knights and castles culture of the rest of Westeros. Aegon and Prince Corin exchanged formal pleasantries in the castle's airy great hall, its windows open to the sea, letting in a hot breeze. Wine was poured, dry Dornish red, spiced in a manner unfamiliar to the Targaryen palate. They sipped, made conversation about trade routes and the plague's toll in the rest of the kingdom. Finally, Aegon broached the key topic. Prince Corin, we have come to see Dorne with our own eyes, to reaffirm the ties that bind us as one realm. It is my hope that the Dornish marches will be peaceful and that trade might flow freely between us. Prince Corin inclined his head. Of course, Your Grace. Dorne has no quarrel with the crown. We pay the taxes agreed upon. We do not raid your borders. We keep the peace within our lands. Is that not what a loyal subject should do? Aegon forced a polite smile. Certainly, but I wonder if Dorne might consider joining more fully in the realm's life. Our other lords send representatives to King's Landing, advise on matters of state. Perhaps House Martell would send an ambassador or a member of the family to keep me informed of Dornish concerns, and likewise keep Dorne apprised of the realm's business. Prince Corin's lips curved in a faint smile. An interesting proposal, Your Grace. Yet you must recall that Dorne's traditions differ. We do not kneel easily. Our climate is harsh, our ways shaped by centuries of independence. We agreed to a loose confederation under your rule because we saw no sense in dying beneath dragonfire, and because we prefer to manage our own affairs. If we send an ambassador, we fear it might appear we are simply another region to be told what to do. That would displease many of my people, who value their freedom dearly. Visenya spoke then, crisp and direct. All of Westeros is under the same crown. If you hold yourselves apart, it invites distrust. We remember how your ancestors once resisted the Storm Kings, the Reach, and all others who tried to breach these deserts. But times have changed. We are one realm now. Princess Dyria interjected softly. We are one realm, yes, but we recall how your war never touched us, how we avoided that devastation. We might ask, are we truly better off entangling ourselves with the conflicts of the rest of Westeros? Would we not be safer behind our mountains and sands, so long as we pay our due? Aegon chose his words carefully. One realm, many customs. That was always part of my vision. I do not seek to quash your way of life, but as the monarchy grows stronger, it will be necessary for each region to have a voice and representation, lest misunderstandings arise. In that spirit, I invite House Martell to send a trusted counselor to my court, one free to depart at any time. That is all. After a long pause, Prince Corin lifted his cup. We shall consider it, Your Grace. In the meantime, enjoy our hospitality. Tour our markets, speak to our people. Let them see that you come in peace. For the next 10 days, Aegon and Visenya explored parts of Dorne, riding across sun-blasted roads, visiting desert outposts, even dipping their toes into the scorching red dunes. Visenya occasionally took Vhagar aloft, mindful to keep her a safe distance from towns so as not to provoke fear. The Dornish small folk observed them with curious reserve. Some children ran after the retinue, hoping to glimpse a dragon, but older folk remembered old stories of the burning of the Riverlands and Lannisport. Though Dorne had escaped that fate, the memory spread far. They were not eager to provoke the Targaryens, yet neither did they bow and scrape like fearful servants. At last, the day of departure arrived. Prince Corin and Princess Dyria saw them off, exchanging formal courtesies. No final agreement was reached regarding an official Dornish envoy, but Corin did not reject the idea outright. He merely said, "We will send word when the time is right." Aegon took that as a mild success, better than open defiance. He was learning that forging alliances in Dorne demanded patience. Thus concluded the royal progress, which had taken many months. Aegon returned to King's Landing with Visenya, both of them weary but satisfied that they had at least walked a portion of their realm's vast lands and encountered the people who lived under the Targaryen banner. The realm had not erupted into new war, nor had any region openly defied them. For all the resentments and tensions, House Targaryen's rule remained intact. The building of the Red Keep continued, a symbol of the monarchy's growing permanence. King's Landing swelled with new arrivals, from laborers to merchants seeking opportunity near the royal court. And so the years continued, each shaped by challenges that tested whether dragons alone could hold a realm as large and fractious as Westeros. A few notable rebellions flared here and there, mostly from ambitious lords or those chafing at new taxes. Each time, Aegon or his sisters responded swiftly, either through diplomacy or the threat of dragonfire. The rebellions were swiftly suppressed, their leaders punished. Over time, the lesser lords began to see the futility of defiance. The realm's broad strokes were set. The Targaryens upon the Iron Throne, their banner a three-headed dragon, their seat in a capital they were molding from raw clay into the largest city in Westeros. Though some questioned whether this monarchy would endure, it had already outlived the memory of Roland Tully's short-lived unification. A single principle had been proven again and again. So long as House Targaryen possessed dragons and the will to use them, no alliance, no fortress, and no rebellion could truly shatter their dominion. The cost had been steep: the ashes of Lannisport, the molten towers of Harrenhal, the thousands of lives taken in war. Many in Westeros harbored a sullen acceptance rather than true loyalty. But as trade flourished and roads grew safer, as outlaws found less breathing room, as the faithful saw their septs rebuilt, as taxes became more predictable, a generation rose that had never known the times before the dragons. That generation called Aegon the Conqueror their king, believing it natural that Westeros should be ruled by one man. The illusions of independence receded, replaced by acceptance of Targaryen overlordship. When Aegon looked upon the painted table at last, now reinstalled in the newly completed Red Keep, he saw the shape of Westeros spread out before him. No longer was it a land of 7 fractious kingdoms, nor that fleeting dream of a single monarchy born of necessity. It was his domain, united by conquest and bound by 1,000 new threads of law, trade, and caution. In the darkest corners, pockets of resistance might still lurk, but none dared mount the grand coalition once attempted. The memory of Dragonfire burned too strongly. Even Harrenhal, rebuilt in part, stood as a silent witness to the might of House Targaryen. The black stones were still scarred, an eternal reminder that no fortress was impervious to a dragon's wrath. Yet, for all his accomplishments, Aegon was not a complacent man. Each day he rose early, consulting with his sisters and council, ensuring that roads, taxes, and justice were administered. He commanded lords to settle petty disputes, or else face the dragon's judgment. He listened to the pleas of peasants and merchants, saw to the supply of the capital, oversaw expansions of the city watch. Always he measured the pulse of the realm, alert for a shift in the wind. He was no king grown fat on luxury. He was an architect, shaping the realm's future. One late evening, in the torchlit chamber that served as his solar, Aegon stood before a high window overlooking King's Landing. The Red Keep was still unfinished, scaffolding clinging to half-built towers, but already it dominated the skyline. Below lay a sprawl of muddy streets lit by lanterns and hearth fires. Farther out, the Blackwater shimmered under the moon. Even at night, small boats moved across the water, carrying goods from distant ports. It was a far cry from the days of a lonely fishing village. The smell of tar and fish mingled with the tang of new stone. A city was rising, drawn by the magnet of the Iron Throne. Rhaenys entered quietly, her footsteps echoing on the newly laid floor. "Brother," she said softly, "you're up late again. Is something troubling you?" Aegon turned to face her. "I was thinking of what we've wrought here. This realm was once united under Roland Tully's fear of the unknown threat we posed. Then we shattered that unity. And now, we forge another unity with ourselves at the top. Are we truly better, or are we simply another iteration of conquest?" She approached, laying a hand on his arm. "We are what we choose to be. We have done terrible things. We have also brought peace, an end to the petty wars and the destruction. If the people thrive, they will see we are more than conquerors." He looked down at her hand. "I hope that is true. Sometimes I see the faces of those who died at Lannisport, and I wonder whether they see me as a liberator or a tyrant." Rhaenys' eyes shone with compassion. "Some hate us still, some fear us, but many others have begun to rebuild lives that are safer than before. Let that be your solace. Rule with care and justice, and in time, the realm will see your intentions." Aegon exhaled, the lines of his face softening. "Thank you, sister. We must remain vigilant. The day we believe ourselves invincible is the day we fail." She nodded, and for a time they stood side by side, gazing out over the flickering lights of the makeshift capital. Beyond, in the darkness, Balerion, Meraxes, and Vhagar slept in their dragon pit, their distant growls occasionally drifting across the night air. These creatures, last scions of old Valyria, had changed the course of Westeros forever. No tower, no gate, no united host had truly stopped them. And in the aftermath of that fiery conquest, Aegon Targaryen found himself not merely a warlord but a king bearing the burdens of an entire continent, bridging ancient differences with a single brand: fire and blood. Still, the question lingered like a ghost in the corners of the Red Keep. If the land had once unified against him, might it do so again if the Targaryens grew weak, if the dragons aged or fell? Such a day might lie decades in the future, beyond the horizon of Aegon's own life. But the seeds of that possibility were sown in the hearts of every proud house that grudgingly wore Targaryen chains. For now, fear of dragons held them in thrall. Yet fear was fickle, as was memory. One day, the realm might recall the dream of a united Westeros free of Targaryen rule. For now, though, the Conqueror reigned supreme, and the land bent the knee. Season followed season. Roads were built, harvests reaped, ships launched. People began to call the settlement at the mouth of the Blackwater a true city, naming it for the king who had raised it from marsh and forest: King's Landing. The rumor-laden taverns where men once whispered of rebellion now hummed with talk of trade and new prospects. More and more, the daily concerns of the realm turned from war to commerce. Peddlers from distant corners of the land traveled safely on the king's roads, guarded by men at arms who bore the Targaryen sigil. Septons preached that the land was at peace by the will of the Seven, though cynics quietly remarked that it was more by the will of three dragons. Either way, the war-torn days of the Grand Alliance had slipped into history, replaced by a new generation that accepted the monarchy's presence. In the 10th year of Aegon's reign, a momentous occasion took place: the official completion of the Iron Throne. Forged in the early days after the war from the swords of those who had fought against House Targaryen, it was a monstrous seat of twisted metal, its edges sharp, its height imposing. Aegon had ordered that it be placed in the Grand Hall of the Red Keep, which by then was partially roofed, though scaffolding still surrounded the upper stories. The day the throne was set in place, Aegon stood before it with Visenya and Rhaenys, and a host of onlookers, lords from across the realm, curious small folk permitted to witness from a distance. Maesters wrote that it was hammered together with 1,000 swords, though in truth the number might have been fewer. Regardless, the sight was awe-inspiring. When Aegon ascended its steps and took his seat upon its barbed metal spines, a hush fell. Sunlight streamed in through high windows, catching the steel so that it gleamed like dragonfire. It seemed a symbol of unstoppable power, uniting fear, conquest, and monarchy in a single shape. If Harrenhal's walls had once defied them, if Lannisport had burned, if Roland Tully's dream had died, then here was the final testament that House Targaryen stood unchallenged. For years to come, those who approached the throne would find it unnerving. Some men cut themselves on its jagged edges if they dared step too close or shifted their weight in supplication. The throne was rumored to be cursed or enchanted, an embodiment of the savage war that had brought Aegon to power. But the people also saw a deeper significance: that the king who sat it might bleed if he grew careless, that sovereignty over such a vast land was never comfortable. The lords of Westeros, proud and cunning, might chafe under the Targaryens, but they would remain loyal so long as the dragons reigned and the throne's occupant proved worthy. And so, beneath the looming shape of the Iron Throne, Aegon Targaryen held court. He settled disputes, received petitioners, accepted tributes from across the seas, and declared new roads, new ports, new alliances. This was the final shape of that question asked so many years ago: what if Aegon the Conqueror had faced a truly unified Westeros? The short answer was that even a united continent had failed to withstand dragonfire and the cunning of House Targaryen. The longer answer was that unity had fractured quickly under the weight of old rivalries and the fearsome demonstration of a city's destruction. In the end, the dragons had prevailed, leaving behind a realm that was neither entirely subdued nor wholly rebellious, but watchful, forging an uneasy acceptance of Targaryen rule. Decades would pass. Aegon would die in time, and new kings of House Targaryen would sit the Iron Throne. Some would be wise, others cruel, and each would be tested by the lords and small folk whose memories of conquest and oppression never fully disappeared. But the monarchy had taken root in Westeros, an inevitability shaped by the unstoppable might of dragons. Years after Aegon's passing, bards would sing of the day when a proud alliance of Starks, Lannisters, Baratheons, Tyrells, Arryns, Tullys, Greyjoys, and Martells tried to stand against the Targaryen storm. They would recall how Harrenhal melted, how Lannisport burned, and how fear turned brother against brother until all were forced to bend the knee. Some songs would lament the cruelty of it. Others would extol Aegon as a visionary who ended centuries of petty squabbling. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between. Conquest by fire and blood, followed by a kingdom's slow mending under the watchful eyes of dragons. In his later years, Aegon himself rarely spoke of that first great campaign, the moment he unleashed Balerian's wrath on Lannisport. When pressed, he would merely say, "We did what we believed we must," and turn away. Visenya, sterner by nature, remained unapologetic. The realm would never have yielded to half measures. They needed to see the cost of defiance. Rhaenys, in moments of candor, admitted that she still had nightmares of the screaming, the acrid smell of burning flesh, the sight of blackened rubble. Each sibling carried that legacy in their own way, a triad of perspectives that matched the three heads of the dragon on their banner. Conquest, law, and hope, bound together by Valyrian fire. Thus Westeros was changed forever. Where once it had dreamed of uniting on its own terms, it now found itself unified by a dynasty from beyond the sea. Where once dragons were myth and rumor, they now soared regularly across the skies, a living symbol of the king's might. Where once men sang of the great houses as sovereign realms, they now spoke of them as wards and vassals to the Iron Throne. Yet the land endured, shaped by the ceaseless tide of seasons, the labors of its people, the weave of love and hate, ambition and fear that underpinned every kingdom. Aegon had seized his place in history, ensuring that the story of Westeros would forever bend around the black silhouettes of dragons against the horizon. And yet, in the quiet corners of taverns and castle halls, an old question still lingered like a stubborn echo. What if the Seven Kingdoms had remained truly united to the end? What if they had found a champion, or discovered a secret to slay dragons? Could the Targaryens have been repelled, preserving the old ways? Some believed so, longing for an alternate history free of Lannisport's ashes. Others, more cynical or simply pragmatic, snorted that the alliances would have crumbled anyway under the weight of competing interests. The only truth any could be sure of was that dragons had come, their fire rewriting the land's fate. All else was speculation, destined to fade into the realm of what if. King Aegon's triumph stood undeniable. The shape of Westeros, one realm, one throne, many proud lords, was a testament to the power he had wielded. His dream of building something new, ironically, would intertwine with the age-old traditions he had sought to bend. Over time, House Targaryen would weave itself into the fabric of Westeros, forging alliances of blood and marriage, adopting local customs even as they preserved their own Valyrian heritage. Whether that balance would hold through the generations was another matter, one that would test the strength of the Iron Throne and the people's willingness to accept dragon rule. For now, in that final image of the Conqueror's era, Aegon sat the Iron Throne, crown of Valyrian steel upon his head, the painted table at his back, his dragons dozing in their pit. Lords approached in a steady stream, some presenting disputes, others offering tribute, still others merely wanting to be seen as dutiful servants. Every so often, the great doors would swing open, revealing a new petitioner with some problem from the far corners of the realm. Aegon would listen, pass judgment, and watch them bow out. This was the daily work of a king, less glorious than riding into battle, but essential for the realm's survival. And though Aegon had torn down a once unified Westeros in flame and blood, he had remade it, in the end, into a realm bound by the Targaryen crown. The illusions of Harrenhal's invulnerability, of Lannisport's strength, of the unbreakable alliances under Tully's banner, all had crumbled. In their place stood a new illusion, a new reality, of a single monarchy so formidable that, for a time, none dared challenge it. The wheel turned, and the dragon soared above it, casting a long shadow over the land. Thus ended the story of how Aegon the Conqueror faced a united Westeros, and how his dragons answered that challenge, leaving a legacy that would echo through the ages long after the last embers of war had cooled.